My son looked me dead in the eye while I held a stack of cancer bills that could bankrupt a normal man. He told me to stop wasting his inheritance to buy myself a few more useless months. I just smiled at him, nodded my head, and signed one quiet charity deed. By the time he woke up the next morning to sip his expensive espresso, the $3 million mansion he called his own had a brand new owner. But to understand how a father could do something like that to his own flesh and blood, you need to know exactly how this illusion began. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old pickup truck outside the city oncology center. The heavy rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the metal roof of my truck. I watched the drops trace crooked paths down the windshield, blurring the harsh neon sign of the hospital entrance. I had spent my life fixing things that were broken. If an engine block cracked, I knew how to weld it. If a hydraulic line burst, I knew how to bleed the pressure and replace the hose. But sitting there staring at a microscopic cellular betrayal inside my own bloodstream, I felt a kind of helplessness I had never known. The engine was turned off, but I could still feel the rumble of it in my bones. My hands, thick and calloused from 40 years of hard labor, were trembling. I was holding a massive stack of medical bills and treatment plans. The paper felt heavy, like it was loaded with lead. They itemized my survival line by line. Chemotherapy infusions, specialized radiation targeting prolonged hospital stays, and a barrage of out-of-pocket medications. The doctor had just looked me in the eye and given me the news. Late-stage lymphoma. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. But then the doctor placed a hand on my shoulder and told me it was highly treatable. He said there was a specialized aggressive treatment protocol that had an incredible success rate for men my age. I was 71 years old, and suddenly I was told I could have another 10 or 15 good years left if I fought for them. The catch was the cost. The specialized treatment was out of network. The insurance I had carried into my retirement would only cover a fraction of the procedures. I flipped through the pages looking at numbers that stretched into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The sum was staggering. It was the kind of money that forces families to sell their homes and empty their savings accounts just to keep their loved ones breathing. I stared out the windshield at the gray afternoon sky. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I was not afraid of dying. I had lived a full, hard life. But I was afraid of the burden this was going to place on my family. Or at least I thought it would be a burden. I had no idea that my diagnosis was going to reveal a truth so ugly it would shatter my entire world. My name is Tom Harrison. For 4 decades, I worked as the fleet manager for a massive mining corporation. I did not sit in an air-conditioned office pushing paper. I was out in the dirt, the mud, and the extreme weather making sure our heavy machinery stayed operational. I managed fleets of massive dump trucks, excavators, and drilling rigs. I spent my days covered in grease and hydraulic fluid, breathing in the smell of diesel fuel and raw earth. I wore steel-toed boots everywhere I went, and I drove an old reliable truck because I never felt the need to impress anyone. I lived modestly, but I was by no means a poor man. I practiced the art of silent wealth. Every hour of overtime, I worked every holiday bonus I earned, every extra shift I took when other men went home to rest. I took that money and invested it. I bought real estate when the market was low. I set up ironclad trusts. I poured my sweat and blood into building a financial fortress for my family. But I never flaunted it. I wanted my son Julian to grow up understanding the value of a hard-earned dollar. I wanted him to know that respect is earned through labor and integrity, not through flashy cars or expensive watches. When my beautiful wife passed away a decade ago, my world went dark for a long time. Julian was all I had left. He was just starting his career as a junior executive at a prominent investment firm. He was bright, ambitious, and deeply concerned with his public image. He eventually married a woman named Chloe. Chloe came from a family that loved to look wealthy, but had nothing in the bank. She cared deeply about country club memberships, designer handbags, and the social status of her zip code. Julian was desperate to keep up appearances for his firm and for his new wife. He wanted to project the image of a wildly successful vice president, but he simply did not have the capital to back it up. So I made a decision out of love. I wanted to give my son a solid foundation. I used my silent wealth to purchase a massive suburban estate for them. It was a sprawling, pristine property worth over $3 million, complete with manicured lawns, high ceilings, and an address that commanded respect. But I did not hand him the deed. I bought the house in cash through a private limited liability company that I entirely controlled. I held the absolute legal title. I allowed Julian and Chloe to live there under a highly specialized revocable lease agreement. I never charged them a single dime in rent. I paid the property taxes. I paid the exorbitant homeowners association fees. I let them play the king and queen of the castle, hoping that freeing them from a crushing mortgage would allow Julian to build a genuine, secure life for his future children. They lived in utter luxury, believing the house was effectively theirs, completely ignorant of the fact that their entire kingdom rested squarely in the palm of my calloused hands. Sitting in my truck outside the hospital looking at my cancer bills, I realized I finally needed to tap into that foundation. I needed liquidity to save my own life. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. I drove straight toward the prestigious Oakwood Country Club where Julian spent every Saturday afternoon. He practically lived there on the weekends, entertaining clients and rubbing elbows with the local elite. The gravel crunched beneath my heavy tires as I turned through the towering wrought iron gates. The grounds were aggressively perfect. The grass looked like it had been trimmed with scissors, and the golf carts gleamed in the afternoon sun. I felt a stark contrast between my life of grease steel and sweat, and this fabricated world of leisure that my son had so desperately adopted. I pulled my old mud-splattered truck into the parking lot. I parked right between a gleaming black sports car and a massive luxury sport utility vehicle. I turned off the engine and grabbed the medical folder. The drive had taken 40 minutes, and my mind had raced the entire time. I had practiced what I was going to say. I assumed my son would be devastated by the news of my cancer. I imagined him hugging me, telling me that we would get through this together, that he would do whatever it took to help his old man. That is what a son is supposed to do. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the grand lobby. The air conditioning hit me smelling of expensive floral arrangements and old money. People in perfectly tailored golf attire stopped and stared at me. I was wearing my worn denim jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed work boots. I looked like a trespasser in their pristine world. I ignored their whispers and walked straight through the lobby toward the outdoor patio. I spotted Julian immediately. He was standing by the outdoor bar holding a crystal glass of bourbon, laughing loudly with a group of men in sharp suits. He looked the picture of success. When he turned and saw me walking toward him, the smile vanished from his face instantly. I saw his eyes dart nervously toward his wealthy friends. A flash of pure, unadulterated panic crossed his features, followed quickly by deep embarrassment. He slammed his glass down on the bar, excused himself abruptly, and marched over to me. He did not greet me. He grabbed my arm forcefully and pulled me away from the crowd, dragging me into a secluded, quiet corridor near the locker rooms. He spun around and hissed at me, asking what on earth I was doing showing up at his club looking like a day laborer. He said I was embarrassing him in front of the firm's most important senior partners. I looked at my son, truly looking at him, and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I did not rise to his anger. I calmly opened the folder and handed him the medical bills and the diagnosis report. I told him the truth. I said, "Julian, I have late-stage lymphoma. The doctors say it is highly treatable, but the specific protocol I need to survive is entirely out of network. The costs are astronomical. I have liquidated what I can, but I need significant cash to cover these procedures, and I need it immediately. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out my request. I told him I needed him to start paying market rent on the estate. He had lived there for years for absolutely free, while I covered all the taxes and maintenance. I told him if he could not afford the rent he needed to secure a mortgage and buy the property from me outright. I explained that the house was my largest liquid asset, and I needed to tap into its value to pay for the treatments that would save my life. Julian stood in that quiet, luxurious hallway, staring down at the medical documents detailing my cancer. I waited for the shock to hit him. I waited for the grief, for the realization that his father was fighting a terrifying disease. But as I watched his face, I saw absolutely nothing resembling empathy. There was no sadness. There was no fear for my survival. His eyes narrowed, calculating the inconvenience I had just dropped into his perfect afternoon. He let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. He shoved the medical folder aggressively back into my chest, forcing me to catch it before it hit the floor. He checked his expensive silver watch, acting as if my cancer was simply making him late for a golf swing. Then he looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a sentence so incredibly cruel that it completely severed 40 years of my unconditional love. He said, "Dad, stop stealing my inheritance to buy yourself a few more useless months." I stood frozen, the breath knocked out of me. Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping into a cold, venomous whisper. He told me that he needed that house exactly as it was to project stability and wealth for his investment firm. He said he could not possibly afford a massive mortgage payment right now, and he absolutely refused to pay rent on a property that he considered to already be his. He looked me up and down with utter disgust. He told me I was 71 years old, that my time was over, and that I needed to accept reality instead of draining the wealth he was waiting to collect. Without waiting for a response, Julian turned his back on me. He straightened his tailored jacket, smoothed his tie, and walked right back out to the sunlit patio. Through the glass doors, I watched my only son rejoin his wealthy friends. He picked up his crystal glass of bourbon and threw his head back in a booming laugh, completely unfazed by the fact that he had just condemned his own father to die. I stood completely alone in that silent, carpeted corridor, holding the bills for my survival in my trembling hands, and in that agonizing moment of betrayal, a cold, unbreakable resolve took root in my soul. I walked out of that country club feeling like a ghost. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of clinking glasses and arrogant laughter. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a bruised purple gray. I walked across the perfectly paved parking lot toward my old truck. My boots felt like they were made of solid lead. Every step sent a jolt of ache up my spine, but it was nothing compared to the absolute hollow crater opening up inside my chest. My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I had stayed up with late into the night helping him understand his algebra homework, the young man I had proudly watched walk across a university stage. He had just looked at my death sentence and complained about the cost. I reached my truck and grabbed the door handle, but I did not open it right away. I just leaned my forehead against the cold, wet metal of the window. I expected the tears to come. I expected to break down and weep like a shattered old man. But the tears never arrived. Instead, a strange and absolute silence settled over my mind. The burning grief that had threatened to suffocate me in that hallway suddenly calcified. It hardened into a block of pure, cold resolve. I thought about my late wife, Sarah. I thought about how we used to sit at our modest kitchen table, drinking cheap coffee and planning our financial future. We skipped vacations. We drove second-hand cars. We patched our own roof. We did all of that so Julian would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. We wanted him to have a springboard. We wanted to build a sturdy foundation so he could reach higher than we ever did. Standing there in the damp afternoon air, I realized something horrifying. We had not built a foundation for a good man. We had built a pedestal for a parasite. Julian was not struggling. Julian was waiting. He was simply waiting for my heart to stop beating so he could collect the final payout of my life of labor. I opened the truck door and climbed inside. The vinyl seat creaked under my weight. I placed the medical folder on the passenger seat. The numbers printed on those pages were still astronomical. The cancer treatments were going to cost a fortune. I still needed cash. If my son was unwilling to help me survive, then I had to rely on the safety nets I had built for myself. I gripped the steering wheel and turned the ignition. The old engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I had one specific safety net in mind. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, listening to the steady idle of the engine. I looked at my hands resting on the steering wheel. They were scarred and thick from decades of handling heavy chains and turning wrenches on massive diesel engines. I had broken 3 fingers on my left hand when a hydraulic press malfunctioned back in 1998. I wrapped them in tape and finished my shift because Sarah was pregnant and we needed the overtime pay. I gave my body to the dirt and the steel so my son could have soft hands and clean suits. And today, those clean, soft hands had shoved my survival back into my chest. Julian did not see a father fighting for his life. He saw an obstacle standing between him and a payout. He saw a delay in his inheritance. The sheer calculation in his eyes when he told me to stop stealing his money to buy a few useless months played on a loop in my mind. It was a sentence devoid of any human warmth. It was a corporate dismissal. I took a deep breath of the damp air blowing through the vents. The sorrow was completely gone now. A fleet manager does not have time to cry over a blown transmission. A fleet manager diagnoses the catastrophic failure and begins the heavy work of dismantling the ruined parts. My son was a catastrophic failure. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot. I left the manicured lawns and the luxury cars behind me. I had to focus on securing my treatment funds. When Sarah passed away 10 years ago, the grief had nearly taken me down with her. The house felt entirely too large and entirely too quiet. In the weeks following her funeral, I realized I was suddenly an old man living alone. I wanted to make sure Julian would have immediate access to funds if something terrible happened to me. I did not want him to deal with frozen assets or probate delays while mourning his father. So I went down to the local community bank and opened a joint emergency savings account. I funded it with $200,000 in cash. It was a massive sum representing years of disciplined saving. I told Julian the account existed solely for absolute emergencies. If I ended up in a coma, or if a disaster struck, he had the legal authority to access the money. I kept the checkbook locked in my study, and I never looked at the account balances again. I trusted my son implicitly. I believed he understood the sacred nature of that money. As I navigated the city traffic toward the downtown banking district, a new terrible suspicion began to take root in the back of my mind. Julian had looked entirely too desperate when he was yelling at me in that hallway. He did not just look annoyed. He looked like a man trapped in a corner. A man projecting wealth, but lacking actual capital. If he was arrogant enough to tell a dying man to hurry up and die, what else was he arrogant enough to do? I parked my truck in the modest lot behind the First National Bank branch. The rain had started to drizzle again, leaving cold spots on my denim jacket as I walked to the entrance. The bank was quiet. A few tellers stood behind the polished wooden counters, helping older customers with their deposits. It was a familiar place. I had done business here for 30 years. I walked straight past the teller line and approached the glass-enclosed office of the branch manager. His name was David. He was a good man who had worked his way up from a junior loan officer. He knew me well. He knew Sarah well. When he saw me standing outside his door, his face lit up with a welcoming smile. He waved me inside and offered me a comfortable leather chair. "Good afternoon, Tom," he said warmly, reaching across the desk to shake my hand. "It has been quite a while since you stopped by the branch. How are you holding up these days?" I shook his hand firmly. "I am surviving, David," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I actually came in today because I need to look at some account details. I have some unexpected medical expenses coming up, and I need to review the balances on my emergency joint savings account, the one I share with Julian." David nodded sympathetically. "I am so sorry to hear about the medical issues, Tom. Let me pull up your profile right now and we can get everything sorted out. We will make sure you have whatever you need." He turned to his computer monitor and began typing. I sat in the chair, listening to the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. I looked around the neat and orderly office. There were pictures of David with his young daughters on the credenza. It reminded me of the days when Julian was small, when I used to carry him on my shoulders during the summer fairs. The memory felt tainted now. It felt like I was remembering a stranger. David stopped typing. The pleasant professional smile slowly faded from his face. His brow furrowed in confusion. He leaned closer to the monitor as if he had misread a number. He clicked the mouse a few times, scrolling down the screen. The silence in the office grew heavy and thick. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit above us. Tom David said, his voice suddenly tight and cautious. "When was the last time you personally reviewed the statements for this specific account?" I frowned. "Not for years, David. I set it up and left it alone. I have my daily checking and my pension accounts for my regular expenses. The joint account was meant to sit untouched, gathering interest until a rainy day. Why do you ask? Is there a problem with the balance?" David looked at me with an expression of deep, uncomfortable pity. "Tom, the current balance in this emergency savings account is $4,200. I stared at him. The words did not make any sense. My mind rejected the information completely. "That is impossible, David," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "I deposited $200,000 into that account. It has been compounding interest for a decade. There should be well over $250,000 in there. Please check the account number again. You must be looking at the wrong file." David shook his head slowly. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. "I am looking at the correct file, Tom. It is the joint account ending in 4822. The balance is $4,200. There has been a massive series of withdrawals over the last 6 months." The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I could not pull enough oxygen into my lungs. The cold knot in my stomach expanded, turning into a jagged block of ice. "Withdrawals." I repeated, my voice sounding completely foreign to my own ears. "What kind of withdrawals?" "I have not touched that money. I have not written a single check or authorized a single transfer." David clicked the mouse again, pulling up a detailed transaction history. His face was pale. He realized he was delivering devastating news to a man he deeply respected. "The funds were not transferred electronically," Tom David explained quietly. "They were withdrawn via physical checks. Large amounts. $10,000 here, $25,000 there. Sometimes 2 checks in a single week. All of them cleared." "Show me," I demanded. "Show me the cleared checks, David. I need to see them right now." David quickly navigated the banking software and pulled up the digital scans of the cashed checks. He enlarged the first image on the screen. It was a check for $15,000 made out to a luxury car dealership. I looked at the signature line. It was my name. Thomas Harrison. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were too large. The pressure was too light. It was a decent forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. "Pull up the next one," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly pitch. David brought up another scan, $22,000 made out to the Oakwood Country Club. The memo line read membership dues and initiation fees. The signature was exactly the same forged version of my name. Another one, I commanded. The next scan showed a check for $18,000 payable to a high-end interior design firm. The memo line read living room renovations for Chloe. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The jagged block of ice in my stomach shattered, turning into a roaring inferno of absolute rage. My vision tunneled. I looked at the digital scans of the forged checks, and the reality of the situation crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsed building. My son had not just abandoned me emotionally, he had been actively, methodically robbing me blind. While I was driving my old truck and eating cheap meals to preserve my wealth for his future, he was forging my signature. He was siphoning the safety net I built with my own sweat and blood to fund his wife's ridiculous designer renovations and his arrogant country club lifestyle. He had stolen over $150,000 in the span of 6 short months. Julian had treated my emergency fund like his own personal piggy bank. He assumed I would never check the balance because I trusted him so completely. He assumed I would die before I ever realized the money was gone. That was why he panicked when I showed up at the club today. That was why he told me to stop stealing his inheritance. He knew the account was empty. He knew he had already stolen the money I needed to pay for my cancer treatments. He wanted me to die quickly and quietly before the absolute truth of his financial crimes came to light. Tom David said, his voice breaking through the roaring in my ears. "This is a staggering amount of fraud. If you did not sign these checks, we need to act immediately. We need to freeze this account, and I need to call the fraud department. We have to contact the police, Tom. This is a severe criminal offense." I looked at David. He was ready to sound the alarms. He was ready to initiate a chaotic public investigation. But I was a fleet manager. I knew that when dealing with a massive structural failure, you do not just start ripping things apart blindly. You secure the perimeter. You gather your tools. You plan the demolition meticulously so the collateral damage only hits the intended target. "No, David," I said, my voice dead calm. "Do not call the police. Do not flag the account for fraud. Not yet." David looked completely bewildered. "Tom, he forged your signature. He stole your money. You cannot just let this go." "I am not letting anything go, David," I replied, standing up from the chair. "I am simply choosing the time and the place of the detonation. I need you to print out a certified physical copy of every single cleared check from the last 6 months. I need official bank statements showing the total amount drained. I need everything stamped and verified by you." David hesitated for a second, but he saw the unyielding determination in my eyes. He nodded and began sending the documents to his private printer. The machine hummed and whirred, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof of my son's absolute treachery. I stood in that quiet office, listening to the printer. The betrayal had shifted from a painful emotional wound into a calculated act of elder financial abuse. Julian and Chloe had looked at my life of hard labor and saw nothing but a resource to be plundered. They had mocked my worn clothes while secretly using my money to buy their luxury vehicles and their high society status. They thought I was just a naive old man who would fade away quietly in a hospital bed. They thought they had outsmarted me, but they had forgotten who I was. I was a man who knew how to handle heavy machinery. I knew how to apply immense pressure to exact points of weakness to break things apart. David gathered the thick stack of papers. He stamped the front page with the official bank seal and signed his name across the bottom. He handed the heavy manila envelope to me across the desk. His hands were shaking slightly. "Please be careful, Tom," David said. "People who do things like this can be incredibly unpredictable when they are caught." I took the envelope. It felt significantly heavier than the medical folder sitting in my truck. This envelope held the weapon I was going to use to dismantle my son's fabricated world. "They are the ones who need to be careful, David," I said quietly. "They built their entire kingdom on a foundation they do not own. And I am about to pull the ground right out from under their feet." I walked out of the bank with the envelope tucked securely under my arm. The rain had cleared, leaving a sharp, crisp chill in the air. I walked back to my truck and climbed inside. I tossed the bank documents onto the passenger seat, right next to my cancer bills. The two folders sat side by side, telling the complete story of my current existence. One folder held the cost of my physical survival. The other folder held the undeniable proof of my son's moral bankruptcy. Julian believed he had won. He believed he had successfully drained my resources and left me to die. He believed his beautiful $3 million estate in the suburbs was his ultimate prize. He thought he was untouchable behind the gates of his country club. But Julian did not understand the true nature of silent wealth. He did not realize that the sprawling house he loved to show off the estate he was using to build his fake empire did not actually belong to him. He was merely a guest living on my charity. And his invitation had just permanently expired. I gripped the steering wheel and put the truck into gear. I did not drive toward my modest home. I turned the truck toward the downtown legal district. It was time to stop playing the role of the generous father. It was time to start operating like the sole owner of a highly profitable enterprise. I needed to see a lawyer. I needed to see my brother-in-law. The silent counterattack was officially underway. The rain had intensified into a heavy, relentless downpour by the time I navigated my heavy pickup truck through the narrow streets of the downtown legal district. I pulled into a tight parking space between two gleaming imported sedans and turned off the engine. The heavy manila envelope from the bank rested on the passenger seat next to my towering stack of cancer treatment bills. I stared at the two folders. They represented the entirety of my current existence. One contained the agonizing cost of my physical survival, and the other contained the undeniable proof of my son's absolute moral bankruptcy. I grabbed both folders, zipped my faded denim jacket against the cold, and stepped out into the gray afternoon. My destination was a towering glass and steel high-rise that housed one of the most ruthless and respected estate law firms in the state. I walked through the revolving doors, my steel-toed boots leaving wet, heavy prints on the pristine, polished marble floor. I ignored the questioning glances from the security guards and strode directly to the elevator bank. I pressed the button for the 34th floor. I was there to see David Lawson. Dave was a senior partner at the firm, and a man who understood the intricate, ruthless machinery of corporate and estate law better than anyone I had ever met. More importantly, Dave was my brother-in-law. He was the older brother of my late wife, Sarah. He had loved her fiercely, and he had always treated me with profound respect. The receptionist immediately recognized me and ushered me into a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the stormy city skyline. Dave was sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk reviewing a thick legal brief. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp features, graying hair, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When he saw me standing in his doorway, he immediately dropped his pen and stood up. He walked around the desk and wrapped me in a firm embrace. He already knew about the lymphoma diagnosis. We had spoken on the phone 2 days prior, and his grief had been genuine and deep. He asked me how this appointment at the oncology center had gone, and I told him the truth. I explained the staggering costs of the out-of-network treatment protocol. Then I placed the heavy manila envelope from the bank directly onto his immaculate desk. I told him I had just come from the country club. I told him I had asked Julian for help, paying for my survival. I repeated the exact words my son had used to dismiss my life. Stop stealing my inheritance to buy yourself a few more useless months. Dave froze. The color drained from his face, and his jaw tightened into a hard, rigid line. He reached for the manila envelope and pulled out the certified bank statements and the digital scans of the cleared checks. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the pages as he processed the sheer magnitude of the theft. He saw the forged signatures. He saw the tens of thousands of dollars siphoned away to pay for luxury interior designers and exorbitant country club initiation fees. Dave slammed his hand down on the desk with a force that rattled his coffee mug. He was shaking with absolute fury. He told me we were calling the federal authorities immediately. He wanted Julian arrested for elder financial abuse and grand larceny before the day was over. I raised my hand and stopped him. I told Dave that I did not want a chaotic public arrest. I did not want Julian to have the opportunity to hire expensive defense attorneys and drag this out in a messy, prolonged court battle. I told him I wanted to execute a controlled demolition of my son's fabricated empire. I wanted to hit him where it would cause the most absolute catastrophic damage to his arrogant ego. I sat down in one of the leather guest chairs and looked Dave directly in the eyes. I asked him to pull up the master file for Harrison Holdings. Dave took a deep breath, forcibly calming himself down. He walked back behind his desk and logged into his secure legal terminal. He pulled up the documents and turned the monitor slightly toward me. Harrison Holdings was a private limited liability company that Dave and I had quietly established exactly 10 years ago. It was the ultimate safety measure built entirely out of my silent wealth. A decade ago, Julian had just married Chloe. They were both obsessed with projecting an image of extreme wealth that they simply did not possess. They were drowning in high-interest credit card debt and taking out massive personal loans just to maintain their facade. Julian had come to me crying, begging for help. He claimed he was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Sarah had recently passed away, and my heart was incredibly soft. I wanted to give my son a stable foundation so he could build a genuine, secure future for his own family. I purchased a sprawling $3 million colonial estate in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the suburbs. I paid entirely in cash, liquidating a massive portion of my long-term investment portfolio to do it. But because I had spent 40 years managing heavy machinery fleets, I understood the absolute necessity of risk management. I knew Julian was reckless. I knew Chloe was driven by boundless greed. I refused to put their names on the property deed. Instead, Dave and I created Harrison Holdings. I was the sole managing member and the absolute legal owner of the company. The LLC purchased the house outright. I then allowed Julian and Chloe to move into the estate. I had Dave draft a highly specialized long-term lease agreement. The document was dense-packed with complicated legal jargon regarding property maintenance tax liabilities and homeowners association compliance. It explicitly stated that the occupants were merely tenants and that the lease was entirely revocable at the sole discretion of the managing member of the LLC. Julian was so blinded by his own arrogance and so eager to get the keys to the mansion that he barely skimmed the paperwork before signing it. For 10 years, he and Chloe had lived in that pristine house, paying absolutely no rent. I quietly covered the crushing property taxes and the exorbitant association fees from my own pension and investments. They believed they owned the property free and clear. They believed they were the kings of their suburban castle. Dave looked at the original signed lease agreement on his screen and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He reminded me of how Chloe had behaved ever since they moved into that neighborhood. Her hubris was entirely boundless. She had weaponized the local homeowners association, turning it into her own personal dictatorship. She regularly patrolled the streets of the gated community, issuing aggressive citations to her neighbors. She had fined a retired schoolteacher $500 because her lawn grass was half an inch above the mandated height. She had threatened to sue another neighbor over the specific shade of beige paint used on their mailbox. Chloe hosted lavish high society parties in the backyard, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen about how Julian had purchased the estate outright through his sheer financial brilliance. She treated the landscaping crews and the maintenance workers like absolute garbage. She walked through life believing she was untouchable royalty. The profound irony that she was acting like a tyrant on a property where she was legally nothing more than a glorified tenant with a $0 lease agreement was a detail that Dave and I had kept entirely to ourselves. But as Dave continued to review the property records on his terminal, I watched his expression shift from bitter amusement to absolute stark horror. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he rapidly clicked through a series of municipal public records. He opened a county property portal and pulled up the legal history of the estate. The silence in the office became heavy and suffocating. Dave looked up at me, and the fury in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating alarm. He told me that Julian had done something far worse than forging checks from my emergency account. He turned the monitor completely around so I could see the screen. There was a massive commercial lien placed directly against the $3 million estate. My heart pounded against my ribs. I asked Dave how that was even legally possible. The house was owned free and clear by Harrison Holdings. Julian did not have the authority to leverage the property. Dave quickly pulled up the associated loan origination documents. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the public corporate filings. He explained that a year ago, Julian had launched his own private equity firm. He wanted to play in the big leagues alongside the billionaire investors at his country club. But launching a firm required massive initial capital. Julian did not have the cash. So my son committed federal fraud. Julian had secretly drafted fraudulent operating agreements. He completely fabricated documents claiming that I had suffered a severe cognitive decline and had legally transferred the sole managing membership of Harrison Holdings directly to him. He forged my signature. He forged a fake notary seal. He presented these fabricated documents to a highly aggressive predatory commercial lender. He used the $3 million house that I owned as collateral to secure a massive high-interest bridge loan to fund his new business venture. Julian had successfully bypassed the lender's basic due diligence because the loan officer was a prominent member of his country club. They played golf together. They drank expensive bourbon together. The lender trusted the image Julian projected and pushed the massive loan through without properly verifying the structural integrity of the collateral. Dave sat back in his chair, running his hands over his face. He explained the catastrophic reality of what Julian had done. My son had not just stolen money. He had committed multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He had leveraged an asset he did not own to acquire millions of dollars in corporate funding. The hubris was absolutely staggering. Julian was living inside a house of cards that was entirely saturated in gasoline. He had mocked my worn clothes and told me to hurry up and die because he desperately needed to inherit the estate legally before the commercial lenders realized their collateral was completely worthless. If I died, the property would naturally pass to him through my standard will, hiding his massive corporate crimes forever. My survival, my expensive cancer treatments threatened to expose his entire fraudulent empire to the glaring light of day. I sat in the leather chair, absorbing the profound depth of my son's treachery. He had built his entire public identity, his business, his marriage, and his arrogant country club lifestyle on a foundation of absolute lies and federal crimes. He viewed me not as a father, but as an inconvenient liability that needed to be eliminated to balance his toxic ledgers. Dave looked across the desk at me. His voice was completely steady and completely devoid of mercy. He told me that Julian had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He explained that if the commercial lenders discovered the collateral was fraudulent, they would immediately seize all of Julian's business assets and press federal criminal charges. He said that Julian was facing a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for the sheer scale of the deception. I looked at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought about the forged checks in the manila envelope. I thought about the fake operating agreements Julian had used to steal the equity of the home I bought with my own sweat. I thought about the cold, empty look in his eyes when he told me my life was a waste of his money. I turned back to Dave. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, precise focus of an engineer standing before a structurally condemned building. I told Dave that we were not going to wait for the commercial lenders to figure it out. I told him we were going to pull the critical load-bearing pillars out from under my son's life ourselves. I told him I wanted to use the absolute legal authority of Harrison Holdings to execute an immediate blind transfer of the property title. I wanted to ensure that Julian lost the house, the fraudulent collateral, and his entire public reputation in one single devastating strike. Dave nodded slowly, a fierce, predatory light igniting in his eyes. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He told me that he knew exactly how to trigger the collapse. The trap had been set 10 years ago. It was time to finally spring it. The first drop of the chemotherapy drugs hit my bloodstream with a cold, metallic ache that seemed to seep directly into my bones. I sat in a sterilized vinyl recliner in the oncology ward, watching the clear liquid travel down the plastic intravenous tubing and disappear beneath my skin. For 40 years, I had evaluated the viscosity of motor oils and the hydraulic pressures of massive earth-moving machines. I knew exactly how fluids traveled through high-stress systems. But watching this toxic medicine enter my own fragile human machinery was an entirely different kind of mechanics. The room smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens. It was a stark contrast to the diesel fumes and damp earth that had defined my entire working life. All around me, other patients sat in their designated chairs. Almost all of them had someone sitting beside them. I saw elderly wives holding the hands of their ailing husbands. I saw grown daughters bringing hot tea to their mothers. I heard the soft murmurs of encouragement and the quiet rustle of magazines pages being turned by devoted family members. I sat completely alone. I had driven myself to the hospital in my old truck, and I would drive myself home. I stared at the blank screen of my cell phone resting on the small tray table next to my chair. Not a single message had arrived. Not a single phone call from my son. Julian knew exactly what day my treatments began. I had handed him the medical file myself, but his silence was absolute. It was a loud, ringing silence that echoed in the sterile hospital room and confirmed everything I had learned in Dave's office the week before. The treatment lasted for 4 grueling hours. By the time the nurse finally removed the needle from my arm, a profound, exhausting nausea had settled deep in my stomach. My legs felt incredibly heavy as I walked out into the hospital parking lot. The bright afternoon sun felt harsh against my eyes. I climbed into the cab of my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white just to steady my shaking hands. I did not shed a tear over my isolation. I simply focused on putting the truck in gear and navigating the city streets back to my modest home. I needed to rest. I needed to gather my strength for the legal demolition Dave and I were meticulously planning. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I noticed a sleek black sedan parked by the curb. Dave was standing on my front porch holding his weathered leather briefcase tight against his chest. His posture was rigid, and his jaw was clenched. As soon as I parked and stepped out of the truck, he hurried down the driveway to help me up the front steps. He could see the physical toll the first round of chemotherapy had taken on me, but his eyes carried a dark, urgent intensity that immediately banished my exhaustion. We walked into the quiet house, and he guided me to the sturdy oak table in my dining room. He did not offer meaningless pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound with a heavy metal clip. He pushed the stack across the wooden table toward me. The papers did not bear the seal of a bank this time. They bore the official stamp of the county probate court. "I have contacts in the clerk's office, Tom," Dave said, his voice barely above a harsh whisper. "They know I handle your estate planning. One of the clerks flagged a suspicious filing submitted yesterday afternoon and gave me a courtesy call. You need to read this right now." I reached for the documents with hands that still trembled slightly from the medical treatments. I flipped past the cover page, and my eyes locked onto the title of the petition. It was a formal motion for emergency medical guardianship and total financial conservatorship. The petitioner listed on the document was my son Julian. The designated ward of the state was me. I read through the pages, and a wave of pure, freezing shock washed over my entire body. Julian had not merely requested to help manage my affairs. He had submitted a sworn legal affidavit claiming that I was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia and profound cognitive decline. He claimed that I was experiencing wild, paranoid delusions and that I was an immediate physical danger to myself. He meticulously detailed fabricated incidents where I supposedly forgot my own name, wandered the streets aimlessly, and mismanaged my personal finances to the point of absolute ruin. He painted a tragic portrait of a confused, helpless old man who desperately needed the court to step in and strip away all of his legal autonomy. My son had attached a psychological evaluation to the petition. It was signed by a private boutique doctor who belonged to Julian's country club. A doctor who had never once met me, never spoken a single word to me, and never reviewed my actual medical history. Yet this man had authorized a professional opinion stating that I was completely mentally incompetent and incapable of making any rational decisions regarding my health or my assets. I looked up at Dave. The bitter taste of the chemotherapy drugs in my mouth was suddenly overwhelmed by the sour taste of sheer absolute betrayal. I asked Dave what this actually meant for my life, if a judge believed these fabricated lies. Dave leaned across the table, his expression grim and unrelenting. "It means he steals your entire life, Tom. If Julian is granted this conservatorship, you cease to exist as an independent legal entity. You will not be able to sign a contract, write a check, or make a single medical decision for yourself. Julian will have absolute totalitarian control over every penny you possess. He will gain total access to your pension, your investment portfolios, and most importantly, he will gain total control over Harrison Holdings." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. If Julian controlled the limited liability company, he could legally ratify the fraudulent commercial bridge loan he had taken out against the $3 million estate. He could legitimize his federal crimes in one single swift motion. He would essentially use the court system to steal the house, clean out my life savings, and completely cover up his massive corporate debts. "But that is not the most horrifying part, Tom," Dave continued, his voice dropping lower. "To justify taking away your autonomy, Julian has to prove that you require constant supervised care. He has already selected a facility for you. It is attached to the petition on the last page." I flipped to the back of the heavy stack of papers. There was a signed admission agreement for a state-run nursing home located on the far industrial edge of the county. I knew that facility. It was notorious in our area. It was a bleak, underfunded warehouse where forgotten people were sent to fade away in heavily medicated silence. It was a place characterized by neglect smelling of ammonia and despair. Julian was not just trying to steal my money. He was planning to lock me away in a dismal institution where no one would ever listen to my protests. He wanted to silence my voice entirely so he could plunder my lifetime of hard labor without any interference. I sat back in my chair, staring at the wood grain of my dining table. The man who filed this petition was not the boy I had raised. The son I had taught to fish, the son I had comforted during thunderstorms and supported through college, was completely dead and gone. In his place stood a parasite corrupted entirely by greed and status. A man who would gladly throw his own father into a miserable state, funded prison just to protect his arrogant high society lifestyle. I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation wash over me. For 10 years, I had carried the burden of protecting Julian from his own terrible instincts. I had quietly absorbed his mistakes, covered his flaws, and tried to guide him toward a genuine life. But reading that petition severed the very last cord of paternal obligation in my heart. He had chosen his path. He had chosen to view me as prey, and now he was going to experience exactly what happens when you try to trap a man who spent his life building unbreakable things. I pushed the court documents back across the table toward Dave. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout in anger. The situation required cold, absolute precision. "Can we defeat this incompetency petition?" I asked calmly. Dave nodded firmly. "Easily. I have already contacted your primary care physician and your chief oncologist. They are both preparing sworn affidavits confirming that your mind is absolutely razor-sharp and your cognitive functions are perfectly intact. We will bury that country club doctor under a mountain of medical malpractice complaints for signing a fraudulent evaluation. This conservatorship petition will be thrown out of court before Julian even gets a chance to stand before the judge." I shook my head slowly. "No, Dave. We are not just going to block the petition. We are going to completely obliterate the very foundation he is trying to steal. He wants the estate. He is terrified of losing that $3 million house because it is the only thing keeping him out of federal prison. So we are going to remove the house from the equation entirely." Dave leaned back, his eyes narrowing with deep, calculating interest. "What exactly do you want to do, Tom?" I thought about the hospital ward where I had spent my morning. While I was sitting in my recliner, receiving my chemotherapy, I had looked through the glass doors into the pediatric oncology wing. I saw small children, pale and exhausted, fighting terrifying battles with more courage than most adults ever muster. I saw parents sitting by their beds, looking overwhelmed by the sheer astronomical cost of saving their babies. Families were being destroyed by the financial weight of the disease I was currently fighting. I looked at my brother-in-law and delivered my final instructions. "I want you to draft a deed transfer today," I said. "Harrison Holdings is going to donate the estate. I want the entire $3 million property transferred completely and irrevocably to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. They can sell it, use it to fund treatments, or turn it into a recovery retreat for sick kids. I do not care what they do with it, as long as it helps families who are actually suffering." Dave stared at me, a slow, fierce smile spreading across his face. "Tom, if we transfer the title, the LLC no longer holds the property. Julian's lease agreement will be instantly voided. He will be legally evicted. And when the commercial lenders find out that the house he used as collateral for his fraudulent loans was just given away to a charity, his entire private equity firm will instantly collapse. The federal authorities will tear him apart." I stood up from the table, my physical exhaustion completely overshadowed by a surge of righteous adrenaline. I walked over to the window and looked out at my old faithful truck parked in the driveway. I had spent 40 years maintaining heavy equipment, ensuring that when an engine was turned on, it ran perfectly. It was time to start the engine on my son's destruction. "Julian wants to treat me like an incompetent, foolish old man. I said, my voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. He wants to steal my legacy to buy himself a fraudulent future, but my legacy does not belong to him anymore. Draft the charity transfer, Dave. Let my son find out exactly what happens when you try to bury a man who is still holding the shovel. The days following my first chemotherapy infusion were a physical blur of nausea and bone-deep exhaustion. My body felt like an old diesel engine running on contaminated fuel. But while my physical strength wavered, my mind had never been sharper. I spent the next week operating with a cold and mechanical precision. Dave and I transformed his downtown law office into a war room. We were not just building a legal defense, we were constructing a financial guillotine. Our first order of business was completely neutralizing Julian's cowardly incompetency petition. I scheduled immediate appointments with 2 separate, highly respected oncologists. I walked into their pristine examination rooms wearing my faded denim jacket and work boots. I sat down and looked those doctors dead in the eye. I told them my own son was trying to legally declare me a confused, helpless old man so he could plunder my savings before the cancer took me. The doctors were genuinely horrified. They put me through grueling, rigorous cognitive examinations. They tested my memory, my reasoning, my spatial awareness, and my executive function. I passed every single metric with flying colors. By the end of the week, Dave had 2 ironclad sworn medical affidavits printed on thick stationery. Both doctors legally certified that Thomas Harrison was 100% mentally competent and entirely capable of managing his own medical and financial affairs. The medical trap Julian tried to set was completely disabled. While I handled the doctors, Dave aggressively hunted down the financial paper trail. He utilized every favor and connection he had accumulated over 30 years of practicing estate law. It did not take long to compile a staggering mountain of evidence. He secured certified copies of the fraudulent bridge loan documents Julian had filed with the commercial lenders. We sat at Dave's wide mahogany desk, spreading the papers out like a map of a battlefield. There it was in black and white. Julian had blatantly forged my signature and used my private limited liability company as collateral to secure millions in corporate funding. Right next to the loan documents, Dave placed the certified bank slips from my depleted emergency savings account. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Julian had practically left his fingerprints all over the crime scene. He was sloppy because he genuinely believed he was untouchable. He assumed I was too old and too tired to ever fight back. He had severely misjudged the man who raised him. With the legal arsenal fully assembled, I realized I needed one final piece to the puzzle. We had the what and the how, but to ensure the commercial lenders and federal authorities struck Julian without mercy, we needed the absolute proof of his immediate insolvency. I needed to document his private ledgers. I needed to prove that his entire private equity firm was a complete fabrication running on empty fumes and stolen leverage. To get that proof, I had to step directly into the belly of the beast. I had to walk into the very house I secretly owned. On a brisk Tuesday morning, I drove my battered pickup truck out to the gated community. I pulled up to the security booth. The guard eyed my rusty bumper with obvious disdain, but he raised the barrier when I gave my son's name. I drove slowly down the winding tree-lined streets, looking at the massive sprawling estates. I finally parked in the wide circular driveway of the $3 million colonial mansion. It was a beautiful structure featuring towering white pillars and immaculate landscaping. I had paid for every single brick, every blade of grass, and every drop of paint. Now it felt like a monument to my greatest failure as a father. I walked up the wide stone steps and rang the doorbell. I was playing a specific role today. I hunched my shoulders slightly, letting the physical toll of the chemotherapy show on my face. I needed them to see exactly what they expected to see. A weak, defeated old man coming to beg for forgiveness. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Chloe stood in the entryway. My daughter-in-law was wearing a crisp white designer pantsuit and holding a sleek silver tablet. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in absolute shock when she saw me standing on her front porch. The look of pure disgust that washed over her face was unmistakable. "What are you doing here, Tom?" she demanded, keeping her hand firmly on the door handle to block my entry. "Julian is incredibly busy today. We do not have time for unannounced visits." I forced a weak, apologetic smile. "I just wanted to see my son, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice soft and raspy. "The cancer treatments have been very difficult. I wanted to come by and try to make peace. I know we had a disagreement at the club, but family should stick together." Chloe let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. She looked me up and down, taking in my scuffed boots and my faded jacket. She did not see a man who owned the very ground she was standing on. She saw an annoying peasant who was tracking dirt onto her imported marble floors. "Fine," she snapped, stepping aside just enough to let me squeeze past her. "But you need to stay out of the way. We are hosting a massive high society charity gala here next week. It is a critical networking event for Julian's investment firm, and the house is completely chaotic. Go wait in the kitchen. Do not touch anything in the formal dining room. The caterers are setting up the floral arrangements." I walked into the grand foyer, keeping my head bowed. The house was a whirlwind of frantic activity. Delivery workers were carrying tall crystal vases and heavy boxes of expensive linens through the hallways. Chloe marched ahead of me, shouting orders at a team of decorators who were measuring the vaulted ceilings for custom lighting. She was spending tens of thousands of dollars on a single party. She was buying ice sculptures and hiring valet parking services, all funded by the money Julian had stolen from my emergency savings account. The sheer vulgarity of her spending made my stomach churn, but I swallowed my anger and walked silently into the massive gourmet kitchen. I stood in the corner near the stainless steel refrigerator, playing the part of the obedient servant. Chloe completely ignored my presence. She paced back and forth across the kitchen island, tapping aggressively on her tablet and talking loudly on her phone to a local politician she was trying to woo. Julian was nowhere to be seen. He was likely hiding in his office, pretending to be a master of the universe. After 20 minutes of waiting, I knew it was my moment. The kitchen was momentarily empty as Chloe rushed out to the driveway to yell at a florist. I quietly slipped out of the kitchen and moved silently down the long, carpeted hallway. I knew exactly where Julian's home office was located because I had designed the floor plan modifications before they moved in. I approached the heavy oak door of his study. I turned the brass knob slowly and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The room was designed to project absolute power. A massive cherry wood desk dominated the center of the space. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves displayed fake leather-bound volumes and meaningless corporate awards. It was the lair of a man playing dress-up. I walked directly to the desk. I did not have much time. I needed to find his personal financial ledgers. I opened the top drawers, but they were empty, except for expensive pens and monogrammed stationery. I dropped to one knee and checked the bottom right drawer. It was locked. It was a simple brass cylinder lock, meant to keep out curious houseguests or cleaning staff. Julian was a man who worked with spreadsheets and digital portfolios. He did not know anything about the physical world. He did not know how things were built, and he certainly did not know how things could be broken. But I did. I had spent 4 decades maintaining heavy machinery. I knew the mechanical vulnerabilities of virtually every lock tumbler and seal ever manufactured. I reached into the pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out a small, flat tension wrench and a standard steel picking hook. I always carried a small set of tools with me out of pure habit. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a very light rotational pressure with my left thumb. I inserted the steel hook and felt for the internal pins. One by one, I gently pushed the small brass pins upward until they clicked into place above the shear line. It was a delicate mechanical dance that required patience and a steady hand. My son thought he was a genius of the modern financial world, but his secrets were secured by a piece of metal I could bypass in under 60 seconds. With a final soft click, the cylinder turned. I pulled the heavy drawer open. Inside, sitting perfectly arranged, were 3 thick black leather binders. I pulled them out and laid them flat on the desk. I opened the first binder and began to read. The documents inside were the unedited private accounting logs for Julian's private equity firm. There were no fabricated projections or padded assets here. These were the real numbers, and they were absolutely catastrophic. Julian was completely insolvent. The ledgers proved that his business had not generated a single dollar of actual profit in over a year. He was bleeding cash. He was using new investor money to pay off the interest on his older fraudulent loans. It was a classic desperate scheme. He was entirely dependent on the $3 million estate to maintain his credit lines. The house was the only piece of collateral keeping the commercial lenders from calling in their debts and triggering a federal audit. If the house vanished from his portfolio, his entire fake empire would instantly evaporate. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. I made sure the flash was turned off. With methodical precision, I turned every single page of those black binders and photographed the damning ledgers. I captured the balance sheets, the desperate email printouts from his frantic accountants, and the lists of the wealthy investors he was currently deceiving. My hands did not shake at all. I was operating with the cold, clear focus of a man securing the final nail in a coffin. I gathered the physical proof of his motive. Julian was not just greedy. He was trapped in a financial corner of his own making. He had filed the incompetency petition against me because he was completely out of options. He needed to legally seize my estate to save himself from federal prison. He viewed my life as a simple mathematical barrier to his own survival. Once I had photographed every relevant document, I carefully placed the black binders back into the bottom drawer. I pushed the drawer shut and used my tension wrench to securely relock the brass cylinder. I wiped the desk surface with my sleeve, leaving absolutely no trace of my presence. I stepped back and looked around the opulent home office one last time. I felt a profound sense of finality. The father who had loved the boy who used to play in the yard was officially dead. The man standing in this office was merely the executioner of a toxic fraud. I slipped out of the study and walked silently back down the hallway. I returned to the kitchen just as Chloe walked back through the front doors, complaining loudly about the incompetence of the floral delivery team. She saw me standing by the refrigerator and rolled her eyes. "Julian is on a conference call and cannot be disturbed," she said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You need to leave, Tom. We simply do not have the time to entertain you today. If you want to make peace, you can call his assistant next week and schedule a lunch. Just let yourself out through the side door. I do not want your dirty boots on the front porch rug." I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at her expensive designer clothes and the arrogant tilt of her chin. She was standing inside a burning building, and she was complaining about the temperature. "I understand, Chloe," I said softly, offering her one final polite nod. "I will not take up any more of your valuable time. Good luck with your big charity gala next week. I am sure it will be an event that no one will ever forget." I walked out the side door and stepped into the cool afternoon air. I climbed into my old truck and placed my cell phone on the passenger seat, right next to the heavy manila envelope from the bank. The legal arsenal was now complete. We had the forged checks. We had the fraudulent commercial loans. We had the medical competency affidavits. And now we had the private ledgers proving absolute financial insolvency. I put the truck in gear and drove away from the towering iron gates of the neighborhood. Julian and Chloe thought they had successfully dismissed a weak, dying old man. They had no idea I was walking away with the absolute power to destroy their entire universe. The investigation phase was officially over. It was time to go back to Dave's law office. It was time to sign the charity deed and light the fuse. The heavy glass doors of the downtown law firm closed behind me, shutting out the relentless noise of the city streets. I stood in the expansive reception area of my brother-in-law's firm, letting the quiet hum of the centralized air conditioning cool my skin. I was wearing my best dark suit. It was an older cut, but clean and carefully pressed. It felt slightly alien after decades of living in steel-toed boots and reflective work jackets, but today was not a day for a mechanic or a fleet manager. Today was a day for a man executing absolute corporate authority. I walked past the polished mahogany reception desk and was immediately escorted down a long, thickly carpeted hallway toward the primary executive boardroom. My brother-in-law, Dave, was waiting for me. He stood at the head of a massive granite conference table, flanked by high-backed leather chairs and towering windows that looked out over the sprawling gray city skyline. But Dave was not alone in the room. Seated around that vast table were 5 individuals dressed in impeccable business attire. They were the board of directors for the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. I had asked Dave to arrange this meeting with their top executives, and he had delivered with his usual ruthless efficiency. These were the men and women who managed millions in funding for children fighting the exact same terrifying disease that was currently running through my own bloodstream. They looked up as I entered their expressions, a professional mix of curiosity and polite respect. Dave stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He introduced me to the room, detailing my long career managing heavy machinery fleets, and my quiet, highly disciplined approach to financial planning. I shook each of their hands firmly. I felt the thick calluses on my palms scratch against their soft, manicured skin. I took my designated seat at the opposite end of the table, looking directly at the people who were about to inherit the largest single asset I possessed. The chairperson of this board, a dignified woman with silver hair and a kind, piercing gaze, thanked me for calling the meeting. She asked how they could assist me today. I took a slow, deep breath, gathering the words I had been practicing in my mind all morning. I did not want to sound like a bitter old man seeking petty revenge against his family. I wanted to sound like a man who understood the profound weight of legacy and systemic karma. I began by telling them about my recent medical diagnosis. I explained that I was currently undergoing aggressive chemotherapy for late-stage lymphoma. I saw the immediate flash of deep sympathy in their eyes. They worked in the business of cancer, and they understood the heavy physical and emotional toll of that diagnosis. I raised my hand gently and assured them that my doctors were highly optimistic. I told them my treatment protocol was manageable, and that I intended to fight for every remaining year I had left. Then I shifted the conversation to the true purpose of the meeting. I told them about my lifelong philosophy. I explained that I had always believed in the power of silent wealth. I never needed luxury cars, expensive watches, or boastful displays of social status. I worked grueling overtime shifts in the dirt and the diesel fumes so I could build a quiet, invisible fortress of financial security for my family. I told them how I had purchased a massive $3 million suburban estate in cash, using a private limited liability company to hold the absolute legal title. I explained that I had allowed my son to live there rent-free under a specialized revocable lease, hoping to give him a head start in life. I paused, letting the heavy silence settle over the granite table. Then I told them the agonizing truth of what that house had become. I explained how my son had reacted to my cancer diagnosis. I described the forged bank slips, the stolen emergency funds, and the fraudulent commercial loans he had illegally secured using the estate as collateral. I kept my voice perfectly steady, but the sheer gravity of the betrayal hung heavy in the room. I told the board that my son had become completely blinded by status and corporate greed, viewing me as nothing more than a disposable obstacle to his unearned inheritance. I looked the chairperson dead in the eye and told her I refused to let a house built on my lifetime of honest sweat be used to shelter a criminal. I told her I wanted to rip that corrupted foundation out from under his feet and turn it into something pure. I wanted to donate the estate in its entirety to their foundation. I wanted them to use it as a sanctuary for sick children or sell it to fund life-saving research. The boardroom remained completely silent for a long moment. The executives were visibly stunned by the sheer magnitude of the proposed gift and the heartbreaking narrative behind it. The chairperson finally leaned forward, her voice thick with genuine emotion. She told me it was the most extraordinarily generous act she had ever witnessed in her entire career. She promised me that if they accepted the property, they would honor my hard work by dedicating every single penny of its value to pediatric oncology. I nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my tired bones. The decision was right. It felt completely clean. Dave stepped forward and opened his thick leather briefcase. He extracted a stack of heavily vetted legal documents and spread them across the center of the table. He was entirely in his element, operating with the ruthless precision of a master estate attorney. He explained the exact legal mechanics of the transfer to the board. Because the property was owned outright by Harrison Holdings with no legitimate outstanding mortgages, I had the absolute unilateral authority to transfer the title. Dave presented the deed of gift. It was a flawless legal instrument that transferred the simple, absolute ownership of the $3 million estate directly from my limited liability company to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. Dave explained that this transfer was silent, immediate, and completely irrevocable. Once my signature hit the paper, Julian would instantly lose any fabricated claim to the property. The fraudulent bridge loans my son had illegally secured would be rendered entirely toxic because the collateral he pledged would no longer belong to him or to my holding company. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen provided by Dave. I looked down at the crisp white pages filled with dense legal jargon. This was the exact opposite of a messy physical confrontation. This was the quiet, devastating application of absolute legal authority. I signed my name on the first dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly, sealing the fate of the house I had bought 10 years ago. I initialed the secondary clauses, transferring the property tax liabilities and the homeowners association registrations directly to the charity. With every single stroke of the pen, I felt a heavy, toxic weight lifting off my shoulders. I was formally detaching myself from my son's web of lies. I was taking the ultimate symbol of his arrogant vanity and turning it into a powerful beacon of hope for families who were actually suffering. I handed the pen to the chairperson, and she signed the acceptance clauses with a steady hand. The transfer was officially complete. The $3 million mansion no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to the children. As the board members murmured their profound thanks and began gathering their copies of the documents, Dave pulled one final sheet of paper from his briefcase. He slid it across the table toward me, his eyes gleaming with a sharp, calculated intensity. "The property transfer is successfully executed, Tom," Dave said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "But we have one final piece of structural demolition to address before we are done here today." I looked down at the single sheet of paper. It was a formal legal notice printed on heavy stock paper with a red court seal stamped in the top corner. Because the foundation is now the sole legal owner of the estate, Julian's $0 lease agreement with Harrison Holdings is automatically null and void, Dave explained, tapping the paper with his index finger. He is currently occupying a property he has absolutely no legal right to inhabit. This is a formal 7-day notice to quit. It is a legal eviction notice demanding that the unauthorized tenants vacate the premises immediately. I stared at the eviction document. It was a standard legal form, but in this specific context, it was a weapon of absolute destruction. Dave continued explaining his strategy. He told me that he had already hired a highly specialized private process server to deliver the notice. But Dave did not want to serve the papers on a random Tuesday morning while Julian was drinking coffee. Dave wanted to maximize the systemic karma. He knew exactly what Julian and Chloe were planning. He knew that my daughter-in-law was spending tens of thousands of stolen dollars to host a massive high society charity gala at the estate the following week. She had invited billionaire investors, local politicians, and the absolute elite of the city's financial sector. Julian was planning to use the lavish party to project an illusion of massive, untouchable wealth. He needed to impress those specific guests to secure more fraudulent funding for his empty private equity firm. Dave looked at me with a cold, unyielding expression. "We are not just going to evict them, Tom. We are going to serve this notice to quit at the exact date and time of their lavish investor gala. We are going to deliver the legal hammer right in front of every single wealthy client they are actively trying to deceive." The brilliance of the plan sent a shiver down my spine. Once the investors saw that Julian was being legally evicted from the very house he claimed to own, his entire fabricated empire would instantly crumble into dust. The public humiliation would be absolute, and the subsequent financial panic would immediately alert the federal authorities to his bank fraud. The investors would pull their money, the commercial lenders would demand their collateral, and Julian would be left holding nothing but his own forged documents. I looked down at the eviction notice one last time. I thought about Julian standing in the quiet hallway of his country club, looking at his dying father with complete and utter disgust. I thought about him telling me that my life was a waste of his inheritance. I thought about the sheer arrogance of a son who believed he could emotionally and financially abuse his father without ever facing a single consequence. I reached out and touched the paper, feeling the coarse texture of the legal document beneath my fingertips. I told Dave to schedule the process server. I wanted the eviction delivered at the absolute height of the gala. I wanted the illusion shattered in the most public, undeniable way possible. I stood up from the granite table, thanking the board of directors one last time for their time and their incredible dedication to their cause. I shook Dave's hand, feeling a deep, unspoken bond of solidarity between us. We walked out of the boardroom together, leaving the heavy paperwork behind on the mahogany table. The silent trap was now perfectly set, and the countdown to my son's absolute ruin had officially begun. The chemical drip was slow, methodical, and entirely unforgiving. I sat in the sterile outpatient oncology ward, watching the clear toxic fluid travel down the long plastic intravenous tubing and disappear beneath the bruised skin of my forearm. For 4 decades, I had diagnosed catastrophic failures in heavy machinery. I knew exactly how synthetic lubricants and high-pressure fluids moved through industrial systems. But watching this aggressive medicine enter my own fragile human machinery was a profoundly different experience. The clinic smelled sharply of industrial bleach and rubbing alcohol, a harsh and biting contrast to the rich scents of damp earth and diesel exhaust that had defined my entire working life. My body felt heavy, as if my bones had been replaced by solid lead. The chemotherapy was doing its job, hunting down the rogue cells multiplying in my lymph nodes, but the collateral damage was devastating. I spent my days shivering under thin cotton hospital blankets, fighting back waves of intense rolling nausea that left me breathless. I was a man who used to lift heavy steel components without breaking a sweat, and now I struggled to unscrew the cap from a plastic water bottle. Yet despite the physical agony, my mind remained absolutely sharp, calculating every single move in the silent war my son had initiated. While I was sitting in that vinyl recliner fighting for my physical survival, Julian was bleeding out stolen cash to fund a spectacular hollow mirage. Dave had hired a discreet private investigator to monitor the estate, gathering a continuous stream of evidence for our impending legal strike. The reports Dave brought to my modest kitchen table were absolutely sickening in their detail. Julian and Chloe were preparing to host a massive high society charity gala at the property. This was not a simple dinner party. It was a calculated theatrical production designed to project an illusion of untouchable wealth to a curated list of billionaire investors and prominent local politicians. The sheer scale of their spending was an insult to every hour of overtime I had ever worked. Chloe had commissioned 3 massive custom ice sculptures, all carved into the sleek modern logo of Julian's fabricated private equity firm. They had hired a premium white glove valet parking service, forcing the crew to erect massive heated tents across the pristine circular driveway that I had purchased with my own cash 10 years ago. They were importing rare seafood from the coast, contracting a 12-piece classical string quartet, and flying in exotic, out-of-season floral arrangements that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. Every single detail of their extravagant planning felt like a deliberate mockery of my entire existence. Chloe had even ordered custom silk drapes to be hung from the ceiling of the grand ballroom, simply because she felt the original paint color did not complement her designer evening gown. They were hiring private security guards to stand at the edge of the property, instructed to keep the ordinary public far away from their exclusive gathering. They were pouring staggering amounts of capital into a single night of fleeting vanity. Meanwhile, I was sitting alone in a sterile room, quietly managing the most terrifying battle of my life, counting the slow, agonizing drops of medicine that were keeping me alive. The juxtaposition between my quiet, dignified struggle for breath and their loud, desperate scramble for social validation was almost too absurd to believe. They were living in a fantasy world constructed entirely of stolen funds and forged signatures, dancing on a stage they had built by robbing a dying man. Every ice sculpture, every imported flower, and every drop of vintage champagne was paid for with the money Julian had siphoned from my emergency medical fund. He was throwing a lavish coronation for himself, inside a castle he did not legally own, using stolen gold to pay the caterers. He was desperately trying to woo high-net-worth clients to save his insolvent company, completely unaware that his entire foundation had already been legally vaporized by the stroke of my pen in Dave's office. I spent my entire adult life measuring the worth of a man by the dirt under his fingernails and the tangible concrete results of his daily labor. When a fleet of massive mining trucks broke down my crew, and I did not pretend the problem did not exist. We rolled up our sleeves, dismantled the broken components, and rebuilt them from the ground up. We created genuine value through sweat, extreme discipline, and honest capability. I tried desperately to instill those same fundamental principles into Julian when he was growing up. I wanted him to understand that true lasting respect is earned quietly through integrity, not purchased loudly with flashy displays of unearned status. But somewhere along the line, the shiny, superficial allure of high society had completely poisoned his character. He looked at the grueling reality of honest blue-collar work and felt only profound disdain. He wanted to wear the crown without ever picking up a sword. He wanted the prestige of being a self-made corporate titan without putting in the agonizing hours of actual sacrifice. He looked at my worn denim jackets and my calloused hands with deep embarrassment, completely ignoring the fact that those same hands had built the financial fortress he was currently hiding inside. The physical toll of the medical treatments reached an agonizing peak on a Thursday evening, just 2 days before their grand investor gala was scheduled to begin. I was sitting alone in the dim light of my modest living room, clutching a plastic basin, completely unable to keep even a tiny sip of water down. The sickness was a relentless, crushing beast that left me trembling and covered in cold sweat. My primary oncologist had written a specific prescription for a highly advanced, specialized anti-nausea medication. The doctor promised it would bypass my battered digestive system and provide immediate necessary relief. The problem was the astronomical cost of the drug. It was a Tier 4 specialty medication completely rejected by my standard retirement insurance plan. The out-of-pocket price at the local pharmacy was over $800 for a single week's supply. I had the money, of course. My silent wealth was vast, carefully managed, and completely secure from Julian's greedy hands. I could have easily driven to the pharmacy and purchased the medication outright without blinking an eye. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at the small white prescription slip resting on my coffee table, a sudden, profound urge washed over my tired soul. I needed to know with absolute, undeniable certainty that the boy I had raised was truly gone forever. I needed to give him one final, crystal-clear opportunity to do the right thing. I owed it to the loving memory of his mother. I owed it to myself before I dropped the ultimate legal hammer on his entire existence and destroyed his public reputation. I picked up my cell phone from the side table. My fingers were stiff and cold as I scrolled through my contacts and dialed his number. The phone rang 4 times before he finally answered. The background noise on his end of the line was incredibly chaotic and loud. I could hear the clattering of fine silverware, the shouting of event coordinators, and Chloe's shrill, demanding voice echoing through the grand foyer as she barked aggressive orders at a team of terrified decorators. Julian answered the phone with an impatient, highly irritated sigh. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was feeling or how the grueling chemotherapy sessions were affecting my body. He immediately demanded to know why I was interrupting him during the most critical, stressful week of his entire professional career. I kept my voice low intentionally, letting the genuine, raw physical weakness of my condition bleed into my words. I did not raise my voice or speak with any authority. I played the role of the desperate, ailing father. I told him the cancer treatments were taking a devastating, agonizing toll on my body. I explained that I was violently ill, dangerously dehydrated, and completely unable to function on my own. I told him about the specialized prescription resting on my table. I explained that my insurance absolutely refused to cover the exorbitant cost of the medication. I asked him directly and humbly if he could possibly spare $800 to help his sick father find a few simple hours of physical relief. I reminded him that I had always been there to support him, and I just needed a tiny fraction of help in my darkest, most painful hour. The silence on the line was thick, heavy, and suffocating. For a fraction of a second, I foolishly allowed myself to hope that a tiny spark of basic human decency would ignite within his chest. I hoped the little boy who used to hold my hand tightly during summer fishing trips would step forward, push the superficial gala preparations aside, and offer to help the man who gave him life. Instead, Julian let out a harsh, incredibly cruel scoff. The sound cut through the phone line like a physical strike directly across my face. He told me that my timing was absolutely ridiculous and highly manipulative. He complained bitterly that he had just been forced to write a massive, unexpected check for the premium catering service and that he was completely over budget for the upcoming charity gala. He spoke to me as if I were a bothersome beggar pleading for loose change on the street. He said his new billionaire investors required an atmosphere of absolute flawless perfection, and he could not afford to divert a single dollar of his resources to cover my personal, unexpected medical expenses. Then Julian delivered the final fatal blow. The background noise of the party preparations seemed to fade away as his voice dropped into a cold, clinical register, completely devoid of any familial affection or basic empathy. He spoke with the ruthless precision of a corporate shark, discarding a worthless asset. "I need this money to build my future, Dad," Julian stated flatly. "Your future is already over." He terminated the call immediately. The line went completely dead, leaving me sitting in the dark living room, listening to the hollow rhythmic tone of a disconnected signal echoing in my ear. I slowly lowered the cell phone to my lap. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a sudden violent surge of fiery rage or bitter disappointment. What I felt was an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute liberation. The heavy, suffocating chain of paternal guilt that had tethered me to that ungrateful boy for 40 years simply dissolved into thin air. The invisible bond of fatherhood was completely and permanently severed. Julian had driven the final heavy iron nail into his own coffin with his own arrogant words. He had officially confirmed that he viewed my life as nothing more than a worthless, expiring contract. He was perfectly willing to let me suffer in sheer physical agony so he could buy imported caviar for strangers he wanted to impress. He had traded his own soul for the illusion of high society status. I stood up from my worn armchair. The crushing nausea in my stomach was momentarily eclipsed by the absolute pristine clarity in my mind. I walked purposefully over to my heavy wooden desk, opened my secure lockbox, and pulled out my primary platinum credit card. I drove myself through the quiet, rain-slicked city streets to the 24-hour pharmacy. I purchased the expensive specialized medication without a second thought, paying the exorbitant out-of-pocket cost instantly. I swallowed the first dose with a bottle of cold water right there in the brightly lit pharmacy parking lot. The intense medical relief began to wash over my battered, exhausted system within 30 minutes. The violent sickness subsided, leaving a cool, steady calm in its wake. As my physical strength slowly returned to my limbs, my mental focus sharpened into a lethal, unyielding weapon. Julian had made his final definitive choice. He had proudly chosen the illusion of wealth over the harsh reality of his own flesh and blood. He had chosen the custom ice sculptures and the expensive valet tents over his father's simple survival. He truly believed he was standing on the precipice of ultimate victory, ready to claim his fraudulent empire and seal his status at the Grand Gala. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes had already been legally vaporized. He did not know that the charity deed had been signed, sealed, and processed. He did not know that the timer on his fake kingdom had already reached 0. I drove my old truck back to my house under the dark, starless sky. The engine rumbled with a steady, comforting power. I felt completely at peace with the devastation I was about to unleash. The time for warnings was over. The time for systemic, undeniable karma had finally arrived. The morning after my phone call with Julian, the wheels of justice began to turn with terrifying speed. I sat in the corner of Dave's spacious downtown law office, drinking a simple cup of black coffee. The advanced anti-nausea medication was working perfectly. My stomach was completely calm, and my mind was incredibly sharp. I watched my brother-in-law operate. Dave was a master of his craft. He did not simply send an email to a generic customer service inbox. He picked up his heavy desk phone and made direct, highly targeted calls to the exact people who held the power to dismantle Julian's life. Dave started with the commercial bank. This was the same aggressive financial institution that had issued the massive high-interest bridge loan to Julian's fabricated private equity firm. Dave bypassed the standard loan officers and went straight to the senior vice president of commercial risk management. I listened as Dave calmly clinically explained that the bank was currently holding a fraudulent mortgage note. He informed the executive that the $3 million estate used as collateral for their massive business loan was legally absolutely owned by Harrison Holdings. He explicitly stated that Julian Harrison was never a managing member of that limited liability company. He detailed exactly how Julian had forged the operating agreements, fabricated the legal signatures, and illegally pledged an asset he had absolutely no rights to. The silence on Dave's end of the speakerphone was deafening. I could hear the panicked, frantic breathing of the bank executive through the receiver. Dave did not offer them a single ounce of comfort. He delivered the final devastating piece of the puzzle. He informed the bank that Harrison Holdings had just formally irrevocably transferred the absolute title of that estate to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. The collateral securing their multi-million-dollar loan had vanished into thin air. It was now owned by a prominent, highly respected charity completely untouchable by any commercial lien or collection effort. The banking executive began to stammer, demanding to know how this could have possibly happened under their radar. Dave simply advised them to contact their federal fraud department immediately. By securing a loan under false pretenses and causing funds to be transferred electronically across state lines based on forged digital documents, my son had committed textbook federal wire fraud. It was a severe felony carrying mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. The bank had no choice. They were legally obligated to report the massive theft to the Federal Bureau of Investigation before the close of business, but Dave did not stop there. As soon as he disconnected the call with the bank, he dialed a direct contact he had at the Internal Revenue Service. Julian had been using the stolen funds from my emergency savings account to pay for his exorbitant country club dues, his luxury vehicles, and Chloe's ridiculous home renovations. He had undoubtedly classified these stolen funds as legitimate business expenses or untaxed personal income to artificially inflate the valuation of his fake private equity firm. Dave handed over the entire meticulously documented dossier to the federal tax authorities. He provided them with the high-resolution photographs of the secret ledgers I had pulled from Julian's locked desk drawer. He handed them a perfectly drawn roadmap to a massive multi-layered tax evasion scheme. I sat quietly in my leather chair, watching the inescapable net of federal law close tightly around my son. The trap was no longer just a legal concept. It was a living, breathing machine, and it was moving forward with unstoppable momentum. The authorities were now involved. The commercial lenders were scrambling in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. Julian was completely surrounded on all sides, and he did not even know it yet. He was still busy picking out expensive table linens and arranging valet parking routes for his absurd high society gala. The rest of the week passed with a strange, heavy tranquility. I continued my rigorous chemotherapy infusions at the oncology center. The toxic medicine flowed into my veins, hunting down the cancer cells, leaving me exhausted and hollowed out. But the specialized medication kept the worst of the physical agony at bay. It allowed me to stand upright. It allowed me to eat decent, nourishing meals in my new apartment. I was slowly rebuilding my physical strength, conserving every single ounce of energy for the impending confrontation. During those quiet evenings, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the man I used to be and the man I had become. I thought about my late wife. I wondered if she would forgive me for what I was about to do to our only child. But every time doubt tried to creep into my mind, I remembered the sheer venomous cruelty in Julian's voice. I remembered him telling me that my future was already over, that my life was nothing more than an inconvenient drain on his impending wealth. A mother's love is profound, but Sarah had been a woman of immense integrity. She would never have tolerated a parasite. She would have demanded absolute justice. I realized that I was not destroying my son. Julian had destroyed himself. He had eagerly constructed his own financial guillotine. He had forged the signatures. He had stolen the money. He had filed the despicable, cowardly petition to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could lock me away in a dismal nursing home. I was simply removing the protective shield I had held over him for 40 years. I was finally letting the natural heavy consequences of his own terrible actions fall directly onto his shoulders. This was not petty revenge. This was accountability. This was the raw, unyielding nature of systemic karma. Saturday finally arrived. It was the day of the grand charity gala. It was the day my son planned to cement his fake legacy in front of the city's most powerful billionaires. I woke up early. The morning light filtered through the large windows of my new apartment, casting a warm, golden glow across the hardwood floors. I made myself a strong cup of black coffee and drank it slowly, feeling the hot liquid steady my nerves. My body ached deeply from the lingering effects of the chemotherapy, and my joints were stiff, but I refused to let the illness dictate my posture. I was a man who had commanded fleets of massive roaring machinery. I knew exactly how to stand my ground against impossible odds. I walked into my bedroom and opened the wide closet. I bypassed the worn denim jackets, the heavy flannel work shirts, and the scuffed steel-toed boots that had defined my daily wardrobe for 4 decades. Reaching into the very back, I pulled out a heavy protective garment bag. Inside was my best suit. It was a dark, charcoal gray 2-piece suit tailored perfectly to my broad shoulders. I had only worn it a handful of times, mostly to funerals and to my own retirement dinner. It was a respectable, deeply dignified garment. I took my time getting dressed. I buttoned the crisp white dress shirt, my thick, calloused fingers moving carefully to secure each small button. I tied a simple, understated navy blue silk tie around my collar. I slipped into the matching suit jacket and smoothed the lapels flat against my chest. I stepped into a pair of freshly polished black leather dress shoes. I walked over to the full-length mirror and looked at my reflection. The physical toll of the cancer was certainly visible. I had lost weight, and my face was drawn, showing the deep, heavy lines of 71 years of hard labor and recent sorrow. My hair had thinned significantly from the toxic medical treatments, but my eyes were completely different. They were incredibly clear. They burned with a fierce, unwavering light. I did not look like a confused, helpless old man waiting to be tossed into a state-run medical facility. I looked like a man who held the absolute power to level a mountain. I looked like the true sole owner of a $3 million estate. As the afternoon slowly shifted into evening, I drove my reliable truck downtown to meet Dave. We had agreed to assemble our entire party at his law firm before driving out to the gated community together. When I arrived, the staging area was already buzzing with quiet, highly focused energy. Dave was wearing a sharp, imposing black suit, carrying his weathered leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. Standing next to him were 2 highly distinguished individuals. They were the primary legal representatives for the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. They had come to officially claim their newly acquired multi-million-dollar property. They carried their own heavy folders packed with the certified deed transfers, the irrevocable ownership documents, and the official tax registrations proving that the charity was the absolute undisputed master of the estate. Standing slightly apart from the lawyers was a man named Gregory. He was a licensed, highly experienced private process server. He wore a neutral, unassuming gray suit, and he held a thick manila envelope tightly in his right hand. That envelope contained the official court-approved 7-day notice to quit. It was the legal eviction order explicitly demanding that Julian and Chloe vacate the premises immediately or face forced removal by armed law enforcement. Dave walked over and placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder. He looked at my suit, then looked me directly in the eyes. "Are you ready to do this, Tom?" he asked, his voice steady and resolute. "Are you ready to take your house back and hand it over to the people who actually deserve it?" "I am ready, Dave," I replied, my voice carrying the deep, gravelly weight of absolute certainty. "Let us go introduce my son to his new landlords." We loaded into 2 separate vehicles. I rode in the passenger seat of Dave's sleek sedan, while the charity representatives and the process server followed closely behind us in a black town car. We drove away from the towering city skyline, navigating the darkening highways as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The evening sky turned a deep, bruised purple, giving way to the brilliant artificial lights of the sprawling suburban landscape. As we approached the exclusive gated community, the sheer scale of Julian's arrogant vanity became immediately apparent. The line of luxury vehicles waiting to enter the neighborhood stretched for nearly a quarter of a mile. Gleaming imported sports cars, massive custom utility vehicles, and chauffeur-driven limousines crawled slowly toward the security booth. Julian had invited the absolute upper echelon of the city's financial sector. He had promised them an evening of unparalleled luxury, all designed to trick them into investing millions of dollars into his empty, bankrupt private equity firm. Dave bypassed the long line of waiting guests. He pulled his sedan directly into the residents-only lane and flashed his official legal credentials at the bewildered security guard. He calmly explained that he was representing the legal owners of the estate and that we required immediate, unhindered access to the property. The guard, thoroughly intimidated by Dave's commanding presence and the thick stack of legal documents he produced, quickly raised the heavy wooden barrier. We drove slowly down the winding, immaculately manicured streets of the neighborhood. The properties grew larger and more opulent as we approached the center of the community. Finally, we turned the corner, and the $3 million estate came into full view. It was a spectacle of absolute sickening excess. The entire front lawn had been transformed into a theatrical stage. Massive heated white tents stretched across the pristine grass. Brilliant shifting spotlights illuminated the towering white pillars of the colonial mansion, casting long, dramatic shadows into the night sky. I could see the 3 massive custom-carved ice sculptures glistening under the bright lights, proudly displaying the fake logo of Julian's fraudulent company. A team of white-gloved valet attendants sprinted back and forth across the wide, circular driveway, aggressively managing the flood of arriving billionaire guests. I could hear the faint, elegant strains of a live classical string quartet drifting through the cool evening air. Waiters in crisp black uniforms carried silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar through the mingling crowds. It was a masterpiece of manufactured wealth. It was a perfect glittering bubble, floating delicately on a foundation of forged signatures, elder financial abuse, and federal wire fraud. Dave parked the sedan near the edge of the property, blocking a section of the pristine driveway. The town car pulled in directly behind us. We stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The music swelled and the arrogant laughter of the city's elite echoed across the manicured lawns. I stood tall, feeling the firm, comforting weight of my dark suit against my shoulders. I did not feel the lingering ache of the chemotherapy. I did not feel the agonizing grief of a betrayed father. I felt the immense, terrifying power of the legal avalanche we had meticulously constructed. The trap had been perfectly set. The federal authorities were already moving in the shadows. The commercial banks were preparing to seize his non-existent assets. And now the rightful owners of the estate had arrived to shut down his fraudulent coronation. I looked at Dave, then nodded to the charity representatives and the process server. We formed a tight, unified line and began to walk straight up the center of the illuminated driveway, heading directly toward the heavy, towering oak doors of the grand foyer. The time for silent wealth was officially over. It was time for a very loud, very public reckoning. The crisp night air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats as we walked up the long, curving driveway of the estate. The towering white pillars of the colonial mansion were bathed in brilliant artificial light. In the distance, I could hear the elegant, sweeping notes of a live string quartet drifting over the perfectly manicured lawns. It was a scene of absolute opulent perfection. But to my eyes, it was nothing more than a highly decorated crime scene. I adjusted the lapels of my dark charcoal suit. The fabric felt foreign against my shoulders after so many decades of wearing heavy canvas work coats and grease-stained coveralls. My body was still aching from the aggressive chemotherapy running through my veins, but my mind had never been clearer. My posture was completely straight. Flanking me on my right was my brother-in-law, Dave, holding his weathered leather briefcase, with the quiet confidence of a man holding a royal flush. To my left walked the chairperson of the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation, along with her chief legal counsel. And walking just a few paces behind us, their polished badges catching the glare of the valet spotlights, were two fully uniformed county sheriff deputies. They were not there to cause a scene. They were there to enforce the absolute, undeniable letter of the law. We bypassed the frantic valet attendants who were busy parking gleaming imported sports cars and stretched limousines. We walked directly toward the massive double doors of the grand foyer. The doors were propped wide open to welcome the city's elite. I stepped into the threshold and stopped just inside the entrance, allowing my eyes to adjust to the blinding crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The house was packed with hundreds of people. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering evening gowns stood in small groups, holding delicate champagne flutes. They were the billionaire investors, the powerful local politicians, and the high society influencers my son desperately needed to impress. And standing at the very center of it all, positioned halfway up the sweeping mahogany staircase, was Julian. He looked exactly like the corporate titan he was pretending to be. He wore a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket and held a microphone in one hand. Chloe stood adoringly by his side, wearing a diamond necklace that was undoubtedly paid for with funds stolen from my medical savings. The crowd was completely silent, captivated by the speech my son was delivering. I held up a hand, signaling my group to wait in the shadows of the entrance. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of lies my son was spinning to these wealthy strangers. "I look around this room tonight and I am profoundly humbled," Julian said, his voice echoing smoothly through the massive sound system. "When I founded Harrison Equity, I did not have a massive trust fund. I did not have a wealthy benefactor handing me the keys to the kingdom. I had a vision. I had an unbreakable work ethic. I built this firm and this beautiful home from the ground up through sheer determination and relentless grit. We are standing tonight in a house that represents what happens when you refuse to accept failure." A round of polite applause rippled through the crowd. The sheer audacity of his words made my stomach turn. He was standing inside a $3 million estate that I had purchased with 40 years of back-breaking physical labor. He was boasting about grit and determination while secretly leveraging a house he did not own to cover his fraudulent federal loans. He was claiming to be a self-made man, while he had literally forged my signature on legal documents to steal my emergency savings. I felt a cold, absolute resolve settle deep into my bones. The time for silent observation was over. I stepped fully into the bright light of the grand foyer. Dave and the uniformed police officers stepped in right beside me. My heavy leather dress shoes echoed sharply against the polished marble floor. The sound of our entry cut through the polite applause like a thunderclap. The wealthy guests standing near the entrance turned to look at us. When they saw the uniformed police officers, their expressions shifted from mild annoyance to immediate alarm. The crowd naturally parted instinctively, creating a wide open path between the front doors and the grand staircase. The live string quartet situated in the corner of the room faltered, and the music sputtered to an awkward, abrupt halt. Julian stopped smiling. He lowered the microphone. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at me, standing at the end of the human corridor, and for a fraction of a second I saw the panicked little boy he used to be. But the panic was quickly replaced by a desperate, venomous anger. He realized instantly that his carefully constructed illusion was in grave danger of shattering in front of the very people he needed to deceive. He quickly raised the microphone back to his mouth, forcing a wide, plastic smile onto his pale face. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption," Julian announced, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "It seems we have an unexpected guest. This is my father, Thomas. He has been terribly ill lately. He is suffering from severe advanced dementia, and he often gets confused about where he is." He gestured to the private security guards standing near the catering tables. "Please escort my father to the back room and make sure he is comfortable. He does not know what he is doing. He is a very sick, confused old man." Two large security guards in black suits began to move toward me through the crowd. But before they could take more than 3 steps, the county sheriff deputies stepped forward, resting their hands casually on their duty belts. The security guards froze instantly, recognizing that they had absolutely no legal authority to intervene against sworn law enforcement officers. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I simply stood my ground. Dave stepped forward, walking past me with calm, terrifying authority. He stopped at the base of the grand staircase, looking up at Julian with the cold, clinical gaze of a seasoned prosecutor. He reached out to the stunned event coordinator standing near the stairs and smoothly took the secondary microphone from her trembling hands. "My name is David Lawson." "Dave," announced his voice, booming through the speakers and commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire and politician in the room. "I am the senior legal counsel for Mr. Thomas Harrison. I can assure everyone in this room that my client is in perfect mental health. He does not have dementia. He is fully competent, and he knows exactly what he is doing. In fact, he is here tonight to make a highly significant announcement regarding the future of this beautiful estate." The crowd began to murmur in confusion. Julian gripped the wooden banister of the staircase, his knuckles turning completely white. Chloe looked frantically back and forth between her husband and the police officers, her perfectly manicured facade beginning to crack under the immense pressure of the moment. Dave turned and offered the microphone to the dignified, silver-haired woman standing to my left. The chairperson of the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation took the microphone and stepped into the center of the grand foyer. She projected an aura of profound grace and unyielding institutional power. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her warm voice echoing through the silent mansion. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am the executive chairperson of the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. We are a national charity dedicated to funding life-saving medical treatments for children battling terminal illnesses. I am speaking to you tonight because earlier this week we were the recipients of the most extraordinary act of philanthropy I have witnessed in my entire career." She turned and looked directly at me, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Mr. Thomas Harrison, a man who has worked tirelessly his entire life, recently received his own difficult cancer diagnosis. She continued addressing the captive audience of wealthy investors. Instead of retreating into despair, he chose to leave a legacy of profound hope. Mr. Harrison, the sole managing member of Harrison Holdings and the absolute legal owner of this entire $3 million property, has officially transferred the complete fee-simple title of this estate to our foundation. Effective immediately, this house and everything on this land belongs entirely to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. A collective massive gasp echoed through the grand foyer. The billionaire investors and the high society elites began whispering furiously to one another. The implication of the chairperson's words hit the room like a shockwave. If Thomas Harrison was the sole legal owner of the estate, then Julian Harrison, the man claiming to be a self-made corporate titan, did not own the very house he was using to project his wealth. Julian stood frozen on the staircase. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Chloe let out a sharp, audible gasp of sheer horror, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Their grand theatrical production had been completely hijacked and flipped into a devastating public revelation of their absolute poverty. But Dave was not finished. He took the microphone back from the charity chairperson and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick document printed on heavy official stock paper, bearing the bright red stamp of the county court. He walked up the first 2 steps of the grand staircase, bridging the distance between himself and my terrified son. "Mr. Julian Harrison," Dave said, his voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Because the property has been legally transferred to a charitable foundation, your previous $0 lease agreement with Harrison Holdings is hereby rendered permanently null and void. You are currently occupying a property owned by a pediatric cancer charity without a valid lease, without paying rent, and without legal authorization. Furthermore, you are hosting an unpermitted commercial event on foundation grounds." Dave held the eviction notice out, holding it directly in front of Julian's face. "This is a formal legal notice of eviction," Dave announced, making sure his voice carried to the very back of the crowded room. "As the new legal owners of this estate, the foundation demands immediate vacant possession of the premises. This unauthorized commercial gathering is officially terminated. You and your wife have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal overnight bags and vacate this property. If you are not off the premises in 60 minutes, the county sheriff deputies standing by the door will physically remove you for trespassing." Chloe let out a piercing, dramatic scream that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Julian stumbled backward, dropping his crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered against the mahogany stairs, sending a shower of sharp fragments and expensive alcohol scattering across the expensive carpet. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The elite guests, the men and women Julian had spent tens of thousands of stolen dollars to impress, stared at him with unvarnished disgust. They were highly sophisticated financial operators. They understood exactly what had just transpired. They realized that the man asking them for millions of dollars in investment capital was a complete fraud, who was actively being evicted from a house he had falsely claimed as his own asset. A prominent billionaire investor standing near the front of the crowd set his champagne glass down on a silver tray. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket and looked at Julian with an expression of pure professional contempt. "I think we have seen enough here tonight," the investor said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. He turned and began walking toward the open front doors. That single movement broke the spell. It was as if a dam had burst. The entire crowd of wealthy politicians, corporate executives, and high society socialites turned their backs on my son. A massive coordinated exodus began. Hundreds of people moved quickly toward the exit, refusing to make eye contact with the humiliated couple standing on the staircase. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man caught in such a catastrophic public disgrace. I stood near the front doors, watching the wealthy guests stream past me into the cool night air. I felt the heavy, crushing weight of the last 40 years lift completely off my shoulders. I had spent my entire adult life trying to protect Julian from the harsh realities of the world. I had covered his mistakes and paid his debts. But tonight I had finally given him the one thing he truly needed. I had given him the absolute, inescapable truth. I looked back at the grand staircase one last time. Julian was slouched against the wooden banister, his head buried in his hands. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, screaming at the caterers, who were already hastily packing up their equipment to leave the doomed party. Their fake empire was gone. Their stolen gold had turned to dust. The commercial lenders and the federal authorities would be waiting for them in the morning, but tonight, they simply had to face the reality of the street. I turned my back on the empty mansion and walked out into the crisp night air. I walked past the melting ice sculptures and the abandoned valet tents. I felt the steady, comforting presence of Dave walking beside me. I was an old, tired man fighting a terrible disease, but as I climbed into the passenger seat of Dave's car, I knew I had never been stronger. Justice had been served quietly, legally, and with absolute, devastating precision. The heavy machinery of truth had finally crushed the fragile illusion of lies, and the air had never tasted so remarkably clean. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was absolute, unbroken, except for the ragged, panicked breathing of my son. Julian stood frozen on the mahogany staircase, his knuckles white as he gripped the banister. For a fleeting second, the immaculate facade of the wealthy, self-made corporate titan shattered, leaving behind a terrified boy who had just been caught in a catastrophic lie. But Julian had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of arrogance, and he was not going to surrender his fraudulent kingdom without a fight. The color rushed back into his face, turning his pale cheeks a dark, mottled red. He lunged forward and snatched the microphone back from the charity executive, his hands shaking so violently that the microphone produced a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback that made several of the billionaire guests wince and cover their ears. "This is an absolute outrage!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and manufactured fury. "This is a pathetic, desperate stunt by a sick, delusional old man. Do not listen to a single word they are saying. I own this estate. I paid for this house. My name is on the property. I am the sole owner of this property, and I demand that these trespassers be removed immediately." He pointed a trembling finger down at Dave and me, trying to rally the private security guards he had hired for the evening. But the guards remained completely motionless, their eyes locked firmly on the uniformed county sheriff deputies standing right beside us. No one made a move to protect him. The wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the high society influencers simply stared up at the staircase, their expressions shifting from shock to a cold, calculating scrutiny. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water. Dave did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to match Julian's hysterical shouting. Instead, my brother-in-law operated with the cool, mechanical precision of a surgeon. He unclasped his weathered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents, holding them up so the bright light from the crystal chandeliers caught the official embossed seals of the county clerk. "You own absolutely nothing, Julian," Dave stated, his voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the massive foyer without the need for a microphone. "You never have." Dave took a slow, deliberate step toward the bottom of the staircase, holding the documents out like a sword. He began to systematically dismantle every single lie my son had ever told. "This is the original operating agreement for Harrison Holdings," Dave announced, tapping the top page. "It clearly states that Thomas Harrison is the sole managing member and absolute legal owner of the limited liability company. Your name does not appear anywhere on this document, Julian. You have zero equity, zero voting rights, and zero claim to the corporate assets." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but Dave seamlessly pulled out the next document, a copy of the very lease Julian had blindly signed 10 years ago. "And this is the residential lease agreement you signed." Dave continued, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "It explicitly categorizes you as a $0 tenant, occupying the property entirely at the sole discretion of the managing member. You are a guest, Julian, a guest who has overstayed his welcome. And as of an hour ago, when Mr. Harrison legally transferred the deed of this estate to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation, your tenancy was officially terminated." Dave held up the final document, the freshly signed deed of gift bearing my signature and the acceptance signature of the charity chairperson. "The foundation is now your landlord and they want you out." Finalized. "The eviction notice you were just handed is perfectly legal, immediate, and non-negotiable." I watched my son physically deflate. The posture of the proud, self-made billionaire crumbled his shoulders, slumping, as the undeniable reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He looked desperately at Chloe, who was standing a few steps above him on the staircase. My daughter-in-law looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her designer gown suddenly seemed absurdly out of place, a theatrical costume on a stage that was being actively demolished. She clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely centered on her sudden loss of social status. She did not care about the betrayal or the crimes. She only cared that her wealthy friends were watching her public execution. The wealthy elite crowding the grand foyer did not need to hear another word. These were men and women who had built massive fortunes through ruthless risk assessment and meticulous due diligence. They had come to this extravagant gala because Julian had successfully projected an aura of infinite, untouchable wealth. He had sold them a narrative of financial brilliance, using this $3 million estate as the ultimate proof of his corporate success. Now that entire narrative was exposed as a hollow, fraudulent mirage. A tall, imposing man in a custom-tailored tuxedo stepped out from the front row of the crowd. I recognized him from the financial magazines Julian always left scattered around his fake home office. He was a prominent venture capitalist, a man who managed billions in institutional funding. He walked directly to the base of the staircase, looking up at Julian with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. "You told my associates that this property was held in your personal portfolio," the venture capitalist said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You explicitly listed this estate as primary collateral in the prospectus you delivered to my firm last week. You asked us for a $20 million capital injection based on assets you do not even own." Julian began to stammer uncontrollably, his hands waving in frantic, meaningless gestures. He tried to claim it was a simple administrative oversight, a misunderstanding with his corporate lawyers, a temporary restructuring of his asset allocation. But his words were completely hollow, echoing weakly against the marble walls. The investors were not just angry, they were mortified that they had almost been conned by a rank amateur. The venture capitalist who spoke up was flanked by a local politician who had been sipping champagne just moments earlier. The politician immediately signaled to his aides, rushing toward the exit to avoid being photographed anywhere near a man about to be indicted. Julian had spent weeks agonizing over the guest list, meticulously selecting the most influential power brokers in the region. He had wanted an audience to witness his ascension to the absolute pinnacle of the city's elite. Instead, he had gathered the exact audience that would ensure he could never work in the financial sector ever again. His reputation was not just damaged, it was completely incinerated in front of the very people who controlled the keys to the kingdom. The venture capitalist turned to the other investors standing nearby and gave a curt, dismissive nod. "We are done here," the man said loudly. "I will be contacting my legal team in the morning to terminate all pending negotiations with Harrison Equity." It was the ultimate death blow to Julian's firm. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, quickly escalating into a loud, angry chorus of voices. Other investors began shouting up at the staircase, demanding the immediate return of their preliminary investments and threatening massive civil lawsuits. The grand charity gala, which was supposed to be Julian's crowning achievement, had transformed into a vicious, unforgiving tribunal. The people he had so desperately tried to impress were now verbally tearing him apart, eager to distance themselves from a toxic, radioactive fraud. But the collapse of his fake private equity firm was only the beginning. The trap Dave and I had constructed was designed to be absolute and inescapable. As the wealthy guests began to turn toward the massive front doors, eager to escape the humiliating spectacle, the heavy oak doors swung open even wider. 3 men wearing dark, unassuming windbreakers and severe, unsmiling expressions stepped into the grand foyer. They did not look like party guests or lost valets. They moved with the crisp, undeniable authority of federal agents. They bypassed the fleeing billionaires walking straight through the center of the room until they reached the bottom of the mahogany staircase. The uniformed county deputies who had accompanied us immediately stepped back, yielding jurisdiction to the men in the windbreakers. Julian Harrison, the lead agent, announced, pulling a leather badge wallet from his pocket and flashing a silver federal shield. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Financial Crimes Division." The remaining color drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a corpse, wearing a velvet dinner jacket. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, stumbling backward and gripping the banister as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. The federal agent pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. We have received certified documentation confirming that you illegally forged the signature of Thomas Harrison on fraudulent limited liability operating agreements and subsequently used property you do not own to secure multi-million-dollar commercial bridge loans. Furthermore, we have probable cause to believe you have actively engaged in severe elder financial abuse, siphoning funds across state lines to conceal your insolvency." My son opened his mouth, but his voice completely failed him. His knees buckled, and he sank down onto the carpeted stairs, his head falling into his hands. The arrogant, untouchable corporate mastermind was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal facing the full, crushing weight of the federal justice system. The agents did not offer him a moment of sympathy. They marched swiftly up the stairs, grabbed him by the arms, and hauled him forcefully to his feet. I watched as they pulled his arms behind his back, the cold, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing sharply over the sound of Chloe's hysterical sobbing. The eviction process was entirely unceremonious and deeply humiliating. With Julian securely detained in federal custody, the process server and the county deputies turned their attention to Chloe. She was screaming wildly, demanding to call her lawyers, insisting that they were making a massive mistake and that she belonged in this house. The deputies were completely unmoved. They calmly informed her that the legal owners of the property had terminated the lease, and she had exactly 60 minutes to gather her essential personal belongings and vacate the premises. The contrast between the glamorous setting and the sheer indignity of the eviction was staggering. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, unforgiving light on the heavy black trash bags Chloe dragged down the mahogany staircase. She sobbed so hard her expensive makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She kept looking toward the open front doors, hoping that one of her wealthy socialite friends might step forward to offer her a place to stay, or at least a word of comfort. But the driveway was entirely empty. The elite crowd had abandoned them the instant the illusion shattered. They were left with absolutely nothing but the immediate crushing reality of their own actions. I stood quietly in this grand foyer, watching the dismantling of their superficial lives. Chloe was forced to run up the stairs, followed closely by a female deputy. There was no time to carefully pack her expensive designer luggage. She was handed heavy black industrial garbage bags by the eviction crew. I watched as she frantically stuffed her expensive dresses, her imported shoes, and her glittering jewelry into the plastic trash bags, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of her new life set in. Her high society reign was over. She was being thrown out onto the street with her belongings packed in garbage bags exactly the way they had planned to throw me into a miserable, underfunded nursing home. The caterers and the decorators were already fleeing the property, stripping the tables of the expensive linens and packing away the untouched caviar. The classical string quartet had packed their instruments and vanished into the night. I walked outside and stood on the wide stone porch, letting the cool night air wash over my tired face. The 3 massive custom ice sculptures bearing Julian's fake corporate logo were already beginning to melt water dripping steadily onto the pristine driveway, dissolving into nothing. 2 federal agents marched Julian out the front doors. He was still wearing his custom velvet dinner jacket, his hands bound tightly behind his back. As they led him past me toward the waiting federal vehicles, he did not look up. He kept his eyes locked on the ground, completely broken and defeated by the very father he had deemed incompetent. I watched the taillights of the federal car disappear down the long, winding driveway. I felt no joy in my heart. There was no triumphant celebration or sense of paternal victory. There was only the cold, hard satisfaction of a mechanic who had successfully diagnosed a fatal flaw and removed the defective part from the engine. Justice had been served quietly, legally, and with absolute precision. The trap was closed, the disease was excised, and the air had finally been cleared. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that true wealth is built on honest labor and that deceit will always collapse under its own weight, leave a like on this video. Please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It always gives this old mechanic a sense of peace to know that hard truths and justice are still valued all across the world. 6 months have passed since that cold and unforgettable night in the grand foyer. The bitter, freezing winter has slowly melted into a bright and forgiving spring. The changing of the seasons perfectly mirrored the profound structural shift in my own life. I am no longer carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my son's destructive greed on my tired shoulders. The legal gears of the federal justice system grind slowly, but they grind with an incredibly fine and inescapable precision. Julian is currently sitting in a stark concrete cell at a federal detention center actively awaiting his final sentencing hearing. The federal prosecutors built an absolute impenetrable fortress of a case against him. Between the forged limited liability operating agreements, the fraudulent commercial bridge loans, and the heavily documented attempts at elder financial abuse, my son had left an undeniable, blindingly obvious trail of arrogant criminality. His expensive corporate defense attorneys tried desperately to negotiate a lenient plea deal, but the sheer staggering scale of the wire fraud left them with absolutely zero legal leverage. The federal judge made it perfectly clear during the preliminary hearings that Julian is facing a mandatory minimum of 5 to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There are no exclusive country clubs out there. There are no expensive bourbon tastings or white glove valet parking services behind those high barbed wire fences. My son is finally learning the brutal, unyielding reality of consequence. He thought he could outsmart the world using a computer and a stolen signature, but the real world always demands payment in full. And Chloe did exactly what any common parasite does when the host body runs completely dry. The very instant she realized the $3 million estate was legally gone and the fraudulent bank accounts were frozen, she rapidly severed all ties. She did not stand proudly by her husband's side during his humiliating federal indictment. she did not offer him a single ounce of emotional support or marital loyalty. The exact moment those heavy industrial garbage bags hit the pavement outside the estate, her absolute dedication to the marriage simply vanished into thin air. She filed for a rapid, aggressive divorce, claiming to the authorities that she had absolutely no knowledge of his corporate crimes or his financial insolvency. Today, my former daughter-in-law is living back in her parents' modest and cramped suburban home, stripped entirely of her expensive designer gowns and her toxic high society pretensions. The wealthy elite friends she tried so desperately to impress have completely and utterly erased her from their exclusive social circles. Systemic karma operates with a beautiful, terrifying efficiency when you build your entire personal identity on a fragile foundation of stolen money and cheap lies. This morning, I drove my battered blue pickup truck out to the gated community for the first time since the dramatic eviction. The uniformed security guards at the front gate recognized my rusty front bumper immediately and waved me through with genuine, respectful smiles. I navigated the familiar, winding, tree-lined streets until I reached the massive property. But the estate did not look anything like the cold, intimidating monument to vanity and hubris it once was. The Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation had worked a profound physical and emotional miracle on the extensive grounds. The grand colonial mansion is now officially operating as a comprehensive retreat and recovery center for families of children battling severe pediatric cancers. I parked my truck near the edge of the wide driveway and simply stood by the open metal door, taking in the magnificent and heartwarming transformation. The wide circular driveway where Chloe had arrogantly erected those obnoxious heated valet tents is now completely covered in bright, colorful chalk drawings made by small hands. The pristine, aggressively manicured lawns that Julian obsessed over are now wonderfully cluttered with accessible swing sets, sturdy wooden playhouses, and small shaded picnic tables. I walked slowly up the winding stone pathway, feeling a deep, abiding warmth spreading smoothly through my chest. The heavy oak front doors were propped wide open, just like they were on the night of the failed gala. But the gentle sounds drifting out from the foyer were entirely different. Instead of the arrogant, obnoxious laughter of billionaire investors and the hollow, pretentious notes of a hired string quartet, I heard the genuine, joyful laughter of small children. I stepped inside the wide entrance and looked around the grand room. The sterile, imposing luxury had been completely stripped away and replaced with absolute comfort. The cold, polished marble floors were covered with soft, thick, interlocking rugs. The towering walls were decorated with bright, messy finger paintings and framed photographs of smiling, resilient families. Tired but visibly relieved parents sat in comfortable, overstuffed armchairs, drinking hot coffee and watching their children play safely in a heavily protected and loving environment. I stood quietly in this corner, observing a young boy with no hair playing with a bright red toy fire truck on the floor. His mother was sitting nearby, holding a warm ceramic mug and looking at him with an expression of pure, unfiltered gratitude. She did not know who I was. She did not know that my lifetime of managing diesel fleets and welding heavy steel had directly paid for the safe, solid roof over her head. And that was exactly how I wanted it to remain. This was the true, unadulterated essence of silent wealth. It was not about receiving public praise or gathering empty corporate accolades from strangers. It was about possessing the quiet, unbreakable power to execute absolute good in the world without ever demanding a single round of applause or a brass plaque with your name on it. My own physical machinery has undergone a truly remarkable and miraculous restoration. 6 months ago, I was sitting alone in a vinyl hospital recliner, feeling my aging bones turn to heavy lead, and wondering if I had the physical stamina to survive the week. But the exact moment I cleanly severed the toxic emotional cord, tying me to my ungrateful son, my entire biological healing process rapidly accelerated. I no longer carried the crushing daily anxiety of funding his fraudulent and precarious lifestyle. I no longer spent my sleepless nights worrying about how to protect him from his own boundless and destructive greed. With my substantial financial assets completely secure and under my total control, I was able to effortlessly afford the most advanced specialized oncology treatments available in the state. The premium targeted therapies, the specialized anti-nausea medications, and the dedicated clinical nutritional support allowed my body to fight back against the disease with incredible ferocity. Last week I sat in the examination room and my primary oncologist handed me a completely clean medical scan. The aggressive lymphoma has officially gone into total and complete remission. I am 71 years old, and my internal engine is running clearer and stronger than it has in an entire decade. By making the difficult choice to let go of the son who wanted me to quietly expire, I ultimately and definitively saved my own life. I walked back out to my sturdy truck, feeling the warm, healing afternoon sun washing over my face. I opened the heavy metal door and sat comfortably behind the steering wheel, looking at the busy, cheerful recovery center one last time. I have spent a lot of quiet time reflecting on the true complex meaning of fatherhood during these past 6 turbulent months. I used to genuinely believe that being a good, loving father meant providing an endless, unbreakable safety net. I thought it meant permanently shielding your children from any real hardship and freely handing them the golden fruits of your own grueling labor so they would not have to struggle the way you did when you were young. But I was entirely and fundamentally wrong. True lasting legacy is not about handing a reckless, arrogant boy the keys to a $3 million house. Unearned wealth does not magically build character or instill integrity. It only loudly amplifies the terrible selfish flaws that are already hiding in the dark corners of their heart. A real meaningful legacy is about the tangible, permanent impact you leave on the fragile world when your calloused hands can no longer do the heavy lifting. I could not save Julian from his own deep moral corruption. He made a deliberate, calculated choice to trade his soul and his freedom for the cheap, shiny illusion of looking rich to a room full of strangers. But by taking back what was rightfully and legally mine, I was able to secure a beautiful, safe future for children who are bravely fighting for a simple chance to grow up. That is a legacy I can stand firmly behind. That is a structure built on a solid, unbreakable foundation of love and genuine care. I turned the key in the ignition, and the old familiar engine roared to life with a steady, comforting rumble. I put the truck in gear and drove slowly away from the estate, feeling a profound, absolute peace settling permanently into my heart. The heavy scales of justice have been perfectly and ruthlessly balanced, and the air filling my lungs has never felt so remarkably clean. If my story resonated with you, and if you firmly believe that true wealth is measured by the good you do rather than the money you hoard, please leave a like on this video. I want you to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any future stories of hard truths and earned justice. Please tell me in the comments down below what city you are watching from, and what time it is right now in your part of the world. It brings this old mechanic an immense amount of joy to know that people everywhere still understand the profound value of integrity and the undeniable power of systemic karma. I have spent a lifetime measuring the worth of a man by the grease on his palms and the sweat on his brow. We live in a loud, chaotic world that constantly tries to tell us that success is strictly defined by the shiny badge on the hood of your imported luxury car or the massive square footage of your sprawling suburban mansion. People will eagerly break their backs and gladly sacrifice their very souls just to project an empty illusion of absolute power to a room full of complete strangers. They desperately crave the glittering veneer of high society status without ever putting in the grueling, back-breaking labor required to actually earn it. But I can tell you right now, with absolute unwavering certainty, that true, genuine wealth has absolutely nothing to do with any of those superficial things. Real wealth is the quiet, unshakable integrity that lives deep inside your chest. It is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror every single morning and know with absolute conviction that you built your entire life on a solid foundation of honest sweat and undeniable truth. Most importantly, it is possessing the silent, profound power to completely protect yourself when the people you trusted the most in this world suddenly rip off their masks and reveal their darkest true colors. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a father could ever be forced to learn. I learned that you simply cannot save a person who has completely fallen in love with their own toxic greed. Sometimes the greatest and most difficult act of love you can perform is simply stepping aside and letting the crushing heavy weight of systemic karma deliver the exact devastating consequences they have rightfully earned. You must find the incredible courage to protect your own fragile machinery, even if it means permanently severing the deep emotional ties that bind you to your own flesh and blood. I am just an old, tired mechanic, and I certainly know how to fix a badly broken engine. But I also know that when a critical part is completely corrupted beyond all repair, you have to permanently remove it before it destroys the entire vehicle. I chose to save my own life, and by doing so, I finally found a beautiful, peaceful legacy that will long outlast my time on this earth. Now I turn this over to you. Have you ever found yourself in a heartbreaking situation where you had to walk away from a family member just to save your own life? Tell me your story down in the comments. I read every single one, and I truly want to hear how you found the strength to rebuild your world. Please let me know what city you are watching from and exactly what time it is right now. It warms this old mechanic's heart to know how far these stories travel. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another story.